Shivering in the back seat of a rusted-out Ford Fiesta, 18-year-old Ilara Wynn pressed a moth-eaten fleece blanket against her chest and listened to the rain hammer the roof like 1,000 tiny fists. A cracked music box, the only thing her dead mother had left behind, sat open on her lap, playing a lullaby that no one was awake to hear. She was homeless, orphaned, surviving on cold French fries scraped from diner plates before the busboys could clear them. 3 months of sleeping in parking lots had taught her one brutal truth: nobody was coming to save her. Then, a cream-colored envelope arrived, thick, expensive, stamped with the seal of a law firm she had never heard of. Inside was a letter, a rusted iron key, and a single handwritten warning from a great-aunt she barely remembered. 3 keys guard the truth. Never sell the house. And never trust anyone who knows your name before you give it. 48 hours later, Ilara stood in the driveway of a crumbling 3-story Victorian mansion on the Oregon coast, staring at a building that looked more like a grave than a gift. A man in a charcoal suit stepped out of a black Mercedes and offered her $25,000 to sign it all away. She should have taken the money. What she found hidden inside those walls would make her a multimillionaire and nearly get her killed. But before we get to the mansion, before the fire, before the vault, and the betrayal, and the blood on the basement floor, we need to go back. Back to a parking lot in Portland, Oregon, where a girl with nothing left to lose was about to receive the most dangerous gift of her life. The Fred Meyer parking lot on Southeast 82nd Avenue was not the worst place Ilara Wynn had slept, but it was close. The overhead lights had burned out weeks ago, leaving the far corner of the lot submerged in a thick, soupy darkness that smelled of wet asphalt and rotting fast food wrappers. Every night around 2 a.m, a security guard in a golf cart would make a slow, lazy loop around the perimeter, his flashlight beam sweeping across the rows of parked cars like a lighthouse beacon. Ilara had learned to time it perfectly. She would slide down below the window line of her mother's old Ford Fiesta, pull the fleece blanket over her head, and hold her breath until the beam passed. If he saw her, he would knock on the glass and tell her to move along. If she was lucky, he would not see her at all. She had been doing this for 4 months now. 4 months since her mother, Catherine Wynn, had died. The accident had happened on a Tuesday. Ilara remembered that detail with an almost surgical precision because she had been sitting in her AP history class, staring at a worksheet about the Great Depression when the school counselor appeared in the doorway and asked her to come to the office. She remembered the counselor's face. She remembered the fluorescent light buzzing in the hallway. She remembered the exact moment the words landed. "There's been an accident. Your mother's car. I'm so sorry, Ilara." And the way the floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet, as though the entire building had been picked up and dropped from a great height. Catherine had been driving home from the night shift at a warehouse distribution center in Tigard. A logging truck ran a red light at the intersection of Pacific Highway and Hall Boulevard. The truck driver walked away with a broken collarbone. Catherine Wynn was pronounced dead at the scene. She was 59 years old. She had been a late mother. Catherine had Ilara at 41 and the two of them had built a small, self-contained world, an apartment, a routine, a quiet understanding that they were all each other had. Catherine worked long hours and came home tired, but she always left post-it notes on the bathroom mirror for Alara to find in the morning. You are braver than you believe. Today is going to be a good day. I love you more than coffee, and you know how much I love coffee. Small handwritten lifelines that Alara kept in a shoebox under her bed. The shoebox was now in a garbage bag in the trunk of the Fiesta, along with everything else she owned. Alara did not cry at the hospital. She did not cry at the funeral home. She did not cry when Gerald Wynne, her stepfather of 6 years, told her that the life insurance payout had been deposited into his personal account and that it was none of her business. She cried 3 days later, sitting in the Fiesta in the driveway of the apartment she had called home since she was 12, staring at the new deadbolt lock Gerald had installed on the front door while she was at her mother's memorial service. Her clothes were in garbage bags on the porch. Her phone charger was still plugged into the wall inside. Gerald would not answer her calls. The cruelty of it was so complete, so mechanical, that it almost didn't register as real. One week, she was an ordinary high school senior with a bedroom and a toothbrush and a mother who left post-it notes on the bathroom mirror. The next week, she was sleeping in a car, eating gas station peanut butter crackers and washing her hair in the sink of a Burger King restroom. She filed a report with the police. They told her that since she was 18, she was legally an adult, and the apartment lease was in Gerald's name. She went to the school counselor. The counselor gave her a list of shelters. She tried 2 of them. The first was full. The second smelled like bleach and something worse, and a man with yellow fingernails stared at her for 45 minutes without blinking. She went back to the car. The Fiesta became her entire world. A 2004 model with 167,000 miles on the odometer, a cracked windshield, and a heater that worked only when it felt like it. The back seat was her bedroom. The glove compartment was her dresser. The trunk held everything she owned, which fit into 2 garbage bags and a backpack. She kept the doors locked at all times. She kept a heavy flashlight under the passenger seat, not for light, but for self-defense. She learned the geography of survival. Which gas stations had clean restrooms and didn't ask questions? Which fast food restaurants let you sit for hours if you bought a single coffee? Which library branches opened earliest and had the most electrical outlets? Which parking lots were dark enough to sleep in, but safe enough to wake up in? She learned to eat on less than $3 a day, a skill that required creativity, humility, and the willingness to eat things that most people would throw away. She discovered that the dumpster behind the Panera Bread on Division Street was emptied at closing time, and that if you arrived at exactly 9:15, you could find bread and pastries that were baked that morning, sealed in plastic bags sitting on top of the trash, like a gift from a god who paid attention to scheduling. She learned to be invisible, to occupy space without being noticed, to move through the world like a whisper, taking up as little room as possible. making as little noise as possible, needing as little as possible from anyone. It was a kind of death, this invisibility. Not physical death, but the slow grinding erasure of personhood that happens when you have no address, no income, no one who knows where you are, and no reason for anyone to care. The worst part was not the cold. The worst part was not the hunger. The worst part was the way people looked through her, or past her, or around her, as though she had become transparent. She would stand in line at a coffee shop, waiting for the bathroom key, and the person behind the counter would look directly at her and then call out to the next customer. She would sit on a bench at the bus stop, and the woman next to her would pull her purse to the opposite side of her body with a small, automatic gesture that said everything without saying anything at all. She was not a person. She was a problem, an uncomfortable, visible reminder of the gap between the way things are supposed to work and the way they actually work. The only possession of any value was the music box. It was small, no bigger than a deck of cards, made of dark walnut, with brass hinges that had gone green with age. When you opened the lid, a tiny brass cylinder rotated against a comb of metal tines and played a melody that Alara had never been able to identify. It was not a song she recognized from any movie or lullaby collection. It was something older, something that sounded like it belonged to a different century entirely. Her mother had kept it on her nightstand for as long as Alara could remember. "It was your grandmother's," Catherine had told her once, and then she had closed the lid and changed the subject with a finality that made it clear the conversation was over. Alara had learned not to ask about her mother's family. Catherine Wynne treated her past the way some people treat a locked room in a house. You walk past it every day, you know it's there, but you never open the door. Inside the music box, tucked beneath the velvet lining, was a single photograph. It showed an older woman with sharp cheekbones and silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, holding a baby in a white christening gown. The woman was not smiling, but her eyes were soft, almost tender, in a way that contradicted the rigid posture of her body. On the back of the photograph, in faded blue ink, someone had written 2 words, Ilara 2. That was it. No names, no dates, no explanation. Ilara had stared at that photograph hundreds of times over the years, trying to extract meaning from it, the way you might try to read a message in a bottle that has been bleached by salt water. She knew the baby was her. She assumed the woman was a relative. Beyond that, the picture was a locked door, just like everything else about her mother's past. She had no idea that the woman in the photograph was named Cordelia Hargrove, or that Cordelia had died 11 days ago in a coastal town 300 miles to the south, or that the last thing Cordelia had done before she died was write Ilara's name into a legal document that would change everything. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. Elara had developed a routine at the Multnomah County Library on Southeast Belmont Street. She would arrive when the doors opened at 10, claim one of the computer terminals near the back wall, and spend the next 4 hours applying for jobs. Dishwasher positions, cashier openings, janitor postings. She would fill out the same digital forms over and over, entering her information into the same blank fields. And then she would wait for responses that almost never came. The problem was the address field. She did not have one. She had tried using the library's address once, but the application was rejected. She had tried using Gerald's apartment, but the confirmation email bounced back. She was a ghost in the system, a person who technically existed, but had no way to prove it. The library had become her anchor, the one fixed point in a life that was otherwise defined by its fluidity and impermanence. She knew the staff by sight, the head librarian with her bifocals, the young reference desk assistant who always wore band t-shirts, the security guard who pretended not to notice when she charged her phone in the outlet behind the periodicals section. They never asked her to leave. They never looked at her the way the coffee shop employees looked at her, with that mixture of pity and calculation that meant they were trying to decide whether she was going to order something or whether they would have to ask her to move along. The library asked nothing of her except that she be quiet and treat the books with care. In return, it gave her warmth, electricity, a restroom with soap, and the illusion of belonging. On that particular Tuesday, she was halfway through an application for a prep cook position at a diner on Hawthorne Boulevard, when the head librarian, a woman named Mrs. Olesko, with bifocal glasses and a cardigan that smelled faintly of lavender, appeared at her elbow. "Excuse me, dear. Are you Elara Wynne?" Elara looked up startled. She had never told the librarian her name. "A letter came for you," Mrs. Olesko said, holding out a thick, cream-colored envelope. It was forwarded through the county social services office. They flagged this address as a possible contact point. Elara took the envelope. It was heavy, the kind of weight that suggested something more than just paper inside. The return address was printed in an elegant serif font. Whitmore and Gaines Attorneys at Law Estate Division, Port Helion, Oregon. She had never heard of Whitmore and Gaines. She had never heard of Port Helion. She opened the envelope carefully, using her thumbnail to slice along the seal. Inside were 3 items. The first was a formal letter on thick, watermarked stationery. The second was a rusted iron key, old and heavy, tied to a faded ribbon. The third was a single sheet of personal stationery, the color of aged ivory, covered in handwriting that was elegant but shaky. The kind of penmanship that belonged to someone whose hands were no longer steady. Elara read the formal letter first. It informed her, in the dry, emotionless language of estate law, that her great-aunt Cordelia Hargrove had passed away on October 3rd at the age of 89. Mrs. Hargrove had died without any surviving children and had designated Elara Catherine Wynne as the sole beneficiary of her estate, which included all real property, personal property, financial holdings, and physical assets associated with the Hargrove Family Trust. Elara was instructed to contact the offices of Whitmore and Gaines at her earliest convenience to begin the probate process. Sole beneficiary. Elara read those 2 words 3 times, her pulse climbing with each repetition. She did not know she had a great aunt. She did not know she had any family at all beyond Gerald, who was not even her blood relative. Her mother had always said they were alone in the world. It's just us, Ellie. That's all we need. She picked up the second item, the handwritten note, and read it slowly. The handwriting was difficult to decipher in places, the letters trembling at the edges, as though the pen had been gripped by fingers that were fighting against their own weakness. But the message was clear. My dearest Elara, if you are reading this, then I have run out of time and the burden passes to you. I am sorry for the silence. Your mother begged me to stay away, and I honored her wish, even though it broke my heart. I have watched you from a distance your entire life. I know what you have endured. I know what you are enduring now. The house is yours. Everything in it is yours. But you must understand, the house is more than walls and wood. 3 keys guard the truth. Find them. Never sell the house, no matter what they offer you. And never trust anyone who knows your name before you give it. The foundation of our family is stronger than their greed. With all the love I could not give you in person, your grandmother, Cordelia. Elara read the note 4 times. Then she set it down on the library table, placed both hands flat on the surface, and stared at the wall for a long time. Grandmother, not great aunt. The legal letter said great aunt. But Cordelia had signed the personal note, your grandmother. The discrepancy was a splinter in Elara's mind, small but sharp, the kind of detail that you cannot stop touching even though it hurts. She did not have the context to understand it yet. She would not understand it fully for several more days, but the word grandmother planted a seed of something that she had not felt in months. Hope. And beneath the hope, deeper and harder, a sense that her mother's locked door was finally beginning to crack open. She called Whitmore and Gaines from the library's courtesy phone. A secretary confirmed the details and told her the property was located at 14 Oak Haven Drive in Port Helion, a small historic logging town on the northern Oregon coast, about 30 miles south of Astoria. The probate process would take several weeks, but Elara was legally entitled to take possession of the property immediately. One more thing, the secretary added, her voice dropping half a register. Mrs. Hargrove left specific verbal instructions with our office. She asked me to tell you, and I quote, "The house will look like it has given up. It hasn't. Neither should you." Elara hung up the phone, walked out of the library, got into her Ford Fiesta, and drove south. The drive from Portland to Port Helion took 7 hours. It should have taken 3.5. But Elara's Fiesta had a fuel efficiency problem that was less a mechanical issue and more a question of poverty. She had $11.37 to her name, which translated into roughly 4 gallons of gasoline, which translated into roughly 120 miles of range. Port Helion was 180 miles away. She solved the problem the way she had learned to solve every problem over the past 4 months, through a combination of stubbornness, desperation, and the willingness to accept discomfort that would have been unthinkable to her 6 months ago. She hypermiled down the interstate at 45 miles per hour in the right lane, drafting behind semi-trucks, when she could coasting down hills with the engine off and pulling into rest stops to sleep when the fuel gauge dipped below a quarter tank. She ate a can of Vienna sausages she had been saving in the glove compartment and drank water from a rest stop fountain. She arrived in Port Helion at dusk. The town revealed itself slowly through the coastal fog, emerging from the gray like a photograph being developed. A main street lined with brick storefronts, half of them shuttered. A harbor with a handful of fishing boats rocking gently against weathered docks. A white clapboard church with a steeple that leaned slightly to the left, as though it had grown tired of pointing at heaven. Everything was damp. Everything was the color of pewter and moss and old wood. Port Helion had the particular sadness of a town that had once been important and no longer was. Elara could see the evidence of its former prosperity in the architecture, ornate cornices on the brick buildings, tall windows with decorative keystones, a former bank on the corner of Main and Harbor that had columns too grand for a town this size. But the prosperity had drained away over the decades, leaving behind a skeleton of ambition dressed in peeling paint and closed signs. The fishing industry had contracted. The timber mills had shut down or moved. The young people had left for Portland or Seattle or points south, and the ones who remained had settled into the quiet, stubborn endurance of people who refuse to give up on a place, even after the place has given up on itself. It was, Elara thought, the kind of town where secrets could survive for a very long time, where people minded their own business, not out of indifference, but out of a deep, instinctive understanding that everyone in a small town carries something they would rather not explain. Elara turned onto Oak Haven Drive and immediately felt the civilization of the town fall away behind her like a discarded coat. The road narrowed to a single lane, then to a dirt track, then to a rutted path hemmed in on both sides by towering Douglas firs, whose branches interlocked overhead to form a canopy so dense that the remaining daylight barely penetrated. The air changed. It smelled of wet earth and pine resin and something else, something older, like the faint trace of wood smoke from a fire that had been dead for decades. The path climbed for another quarter mile before the trees opened up and the Hargrove estate revealed itself. Elara stopped the car. She did not turn off the engine. She just sat there, both hands on the steering wheel, staring through the cracked windshield at the building in front of her. Thornfield Manor was enormous. 3 stories of Victorian architecture, or rather 3 stories of what Victorian architecture becomes when it is left alone for too long. The house looked like it had been built by someone with grand ambitions and then systematically abandoned by everyone who came after. The dark gray paint had peeled away from the clapboard siding in long, curling strips, exposing the rotting wood beneath, like skin pulling back from a wound. The roof sagged dramatically in the center, forming a concave depression that collected rainwater in a stagnant pool visible even from the driveway. At least half of the windows on the upper floors were shattered, and thick ropes of ivy had crawled through the openings and spread across the facade with the slow, relentless aggression of something that intended to consume the building entirely. The front porch wrapped around the first floor in what had once been a graceful curve, but was now a splintered obstacle course of broken boards and collapsed railings. The heavy oak front door hung from a single hinge tilted at an angle that made it look like the house was showing its teeth. Beyond the house at the edge of the tree line to the south, Elara could see a low iron fence surrounding a small clearing. Even from a distance, she could make out the shapes of headstones. 4 of them arranged in a neat row. A family cemetery. Elara turned off the engine. The silence that followed was so complete that she could hear her own heartbeat. She had imagined a sanctuary. A warm, solid house with a fireplace and a bed and a door that locked from the inside. A place where she could stop running, stop surviving, stop being afraid. Instead, she was looking at a building that appeared to be in the advanced stages of dying. A structure so decayed that the idea of sleeping inside it felt less like shelter and more like a dare. She thought about turning around. She thought about driving back to Portland, back to the parking lot, back to the fleece blanket, and the cold, and the security guard with his golf cart. At least, that was a misery she understood. But then she looked down at the music box on the passenger seat, and she thought about Cordelia's note. The house will look like it has given up. It hasn't. Neither should you. Elara got out of the car. The coastal wind hit her immediately sharp and cold, and carrying the smell of salt and decaying wood. She pulled her thin hoodie tighter around her body and walked up the driveway toward the front porch, testing each step before committing her weight. The boards groaned but held. The hanging front door resisted for a moment when she pushed it, then swung inward with a long theatrical creak that echoed through the interior of the house like a moan. She stepped inside. The grand foyer of Thornfield Manor smelled the way old things smell when they have been left alone in the dark for too long. A thick, layered scent of mildew-damp earth and the faintly sweet rot of decaying wood. The ceiling soared above her, lost in shadows. A massive staircase climbed the far wall, its banister draped in cobwebs so thick and so old that they had taken on the texture of gray felt. Antique furniture chairs, tables, a grandfather clock with its face smashed stood beneath yellowing dust sheets like ghosts frozen in mid-gesture. The wallpaper had detached from the plaster in long, sad ribbons that hung motionless in the still air. The hardwood floor was buckled and warped, and every step Elara took produced a sound that was somewhere between a groan and a warning. There was no electricity, no running water. The light from outside was fading fast, and the interior of the house was sinking into a darkness so complete that it felt almost physical, a weight pressing against her skin. Elara pulled out the cheap plastic flashlight she kept in her backpack and clicked it on. The beam cut a narrow white tunnel through the gloom, illuminating dust motes that swirled in the disturbed air like tiny, lazy planets. She explored the first floor methodically room by room. A formal dining room with a table long enough to seat 12, every surface covered in a thick fur of dust. A sitting room with a collapsed bookshelf and water damage so severe that the ceiling plaster had fallen in chunks the size of dinner plates. A kitchen that smelled of rust and old grease, its fixtures green with oxidation. And at the back of the house, near the servants' entrance, a small parlor with a stone fireplace. An armchair that appeared structurally intact, and a rug that, while filthy, was at least dry. This would be her room. She dragged the armchair in front of the parlor door, positioning it as a barricade. She unrolled her sleeping bag on the rug. She set the music box on the mantelpiece and the flashlight on the floor where she could reach it quickly. Then she sat down with her back against the wall and ate the last of her Vienna sausages. The house settled around her. That is the only way to describe the sounds a building makes when the temperature drops and the wood contracts and the structure shifts on its foundation. It was a symphony of creaks and groans and sudden sharp pops that sounded like something snapping, like bones breaking in a distant room. Beneath the structural sounds, she could hear the skittering of rodents in the walls and the low, constant whisper of the wind finding its way through the cracks and the broken windows and the gaps where the house had pulled apart from itself. She did not sleep well, but she did sleep. And when she woke up in the thin gray light of morning, cold and stiff and aching from the hard floor, she experienced something she had not felt since the night Gerald changed the locks. She was inside. She was behind a closed door. The space around her, however broken and filthy and cold, belonged to her. Not to a landlord, not to a parking lot, not to a shelter with rules and curfews and a man with yellow fingernails. To her. For the first time in 4 months, Elara Wynne was home. The sound that woke her the second morning was not the house settling. It was footsteps. Elara's eyes snapped open in the gray half-light. She held absolutely still, her breath caught in her throat, her ears straining. The sound came again, a slow, deliberate rhythm of someone walking on the floor above her. Not the random creaking of old wood. not the scurrying of rodents. Footsteps, heavy, measured, moving from one end of the second floor to the other. Then they stopped. Elara reached for the fireplace poker she had placed next to her sleeping bag. It was iron-heavy, pitted with rust, and it was the closest thing to a weapon she had. She wrapped both hands around it and stood up slowly, every muscle in her body coiled tight. The footsteps did not resume. She stood there for 5 minutes, listening. The house was silent except for the wind. She told herself it was the building settling. She told herself old houses make sounds that mimic human activity. She told herself there was nobody up there. She did not believe any of it. Moving as quietly as she could, she pushed the armchair away from the parlor door and stepped into the hallway. The staircase was directly ahead, climbing into shadow. She raised the fireplace poker in one hand and the flashlight in the other and began to ascend. The second floor was worse than the first. The water damage was more severe here, the ceiling plaster completely gone in some rooms, exposing the skeletal framework of the rafters above. Puddles of stagnant water had collected in the depressions of the warped floor. The smell was stronger, not just mildew, but something organic and sharp, like the smell of a wound. Elara checked each room, pushing open doors that resisted with swollen, damp wood. Empty bedrooms, an empty bathroom with a clawfoot tub filled with black water, a linen closet containing nothing but mouse droppings. At the end of the hallway, she found the source of what she had heard. Or at least she found something. One of the bedroom doors was already open. Inside, the room was empty except for a large oil painting that hung on the far wall. The painting depicted a woman, silver hair, sharp cheekbones, a severe expression softened by eyes that held a deep, complicated warmth. The woman was seated in a high-backed chair, and behind her, through a painted window, was a landscape that Elara recognized immediately as the view from the front porch of this very house. It was Cordelia, the same woman from the photograph in the music box, only younger, perhaps in her 60s. The painting had been executed with skill and care, the kind of portrait that a family commissions to hang above a mantelpiece for generations. Someone had taken a knife to it. A single long slash ran diagonally across the canvas, cutting through Cordelia's face from the upper left corner to the lower right. The cut was clean, deliberate, and violent. It was not the work of decay or accident. Someone had stood in this room and deliberately destroyed this portrait. But that was not the detail that made Elara's blood run cold. On the floor beneath the painting, clearly visible in the beam of her flashlight, were footprints. Bootprints, large, pressed into the thick dust that covered the hardwood. And the dust around them was disturbed in a way that was fresh. Not weeks old, not months old. Recent. The prints led from the painting to the doorway where Elara was standing, and then continued down the hallway toward the back staircase. Someone had been in this house. Recently. possibly within the last few days. Elara descended the stairs quickly, her heart slamming against her ribs. She went directly to the front door, which she had propped shut with a piece of broken furniture, and checked it. It was undisturbed. She checked every window on the first floor, all still boarded or intact. Whoever had been upstairs had either entered through one of the broken upper windows or through a door she had not yet found. She was still processing this when she heard the front door scrape open behind her. She spun, raising the poker, and found herself face to face with a young man standing in the foyer with his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. He was in his mid-20s, wearing faded denim work pants, a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and a canvas jacket that had been patched at the elbows with duct tape. He had a rugged, weathered face, the kind of face that suggested he had spent most of his life outdoors, and there was a smear of dirt across his right cheek. Under one arm, he carried a yellow hard hat. "Whoa," he said. "Easy. I'm not here to cause trouble." "Who are you?" Elara demanded, keeping the poker raised. "And how do you know where I am?" The young man lowered his hands slowly. "My name is Callum Bride. I'm a contractor, structural restoration, historical buildings. Your great-aunt hired me 6 months ago to reinforce the load-bearing beams in the basement. I've got a key she gave me." He held up a brass key different from the iron one Elara had received. "I saw the car in the driveway this morning and wanted to make sure everything was okay. I heard Mrs. Hargrove passed. I'm sorry." Elara's eyes narrowed. "How did you know my name?" Callum blinked. "What? When you came in, before I said anything. How did you know who I was?" He hesitated just for a fraction of a second. "Mrs. Hargrove talked about you. She described you. Brown hair, thin, probably driving an old Ford. She told me you might show up after she was gone." It was a reasonable answer. It was a perfectly logical answer. But Cordelia's warning pulsed in Elara's mind like a heartbeat. Never trust anyone who knows your name before you give it. "I'm going to call the law firm," Elara said, not lowering the poker. "Whitmore and Gaines. If they confirm you, fine. If they don't, you leave." "Fair enough," Callum said, and he stood perfectly still while she made the call. The secretary at Whitmore and Gaines confirmed it. Cordelia Hargrove had indeed hired a contractor named Callum Bride approximately 6 months before her death to perform structural work on the basement. He had been paid a retainer, but was still owed a significant balance for completed work. He had a legal right to access the property to finish the job. Elara hung up and lowered the poker, but she did not set it down. "The law firm says you're legitimate," she said. "But I want to be clear about something. This is my house. You work on the basement, and that's it. You don't go upstairs. You don't go through my things, and you knock before you come inside." "Understood," Callum said. He looked around the foyer, taking in the decay, the dust, the hanging wallpaper. "You know, Victor Ashford has been circling this place like a vulture for years. He came by yesterday while I was unloading tools. Asked me if the new owner had shown up yet. I didn't tell him anything. Victor Ashford came here yesterday. Elara felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. He comes by every few weeks. Sometimes he just sits in his car and stares at the house. It's unsettling, honestly. Your great aunt couldn't stand him. She used to say he wasn't after the property. He was after what the property was keeping from him. Elara thought about the slashed painting upstairs, the fresh boot prints in the dust. Someone was in the house before I got here, she said quietly. Upstairs. They cut up a painting of Cordelia. Callum's expression darkened. That sounds like something Ashford would do, or have done. He's got people. Who is he exactly? Victor Ashford. He owns Ashford Development, biggest real estate outfit on the northern Oregon coast. Buys up old properties, tears them down, builds luxury condos and vacation rentals. He's been trying to buy this land for at least a decade. Offered your great aunt a fortune for it. She turned him down every single time. He offered me $25,000 yesterday, Elara said. The second I got out of my car. Callum let out a low, derisive whistle. 25 grand for this property. The land alone is worth 10 times that minimum. And he shows up with cash on day one before you've even had time to look around. He shook his head. He doesn't want the land, Elara. He wants something inside this house. She needed to know more about the man who was trying to take her inheritance. Over the next 2 days, Elara pieced together a picture of Victor Ashford from Callum's descriptions and from old newspaper clippings she found stacked in Cordelia's study. Victor was 58, the third generation of Ashfords in Port Helion. His grandfather, Thomas Ashford, had founded Ashford Timber Company in 1929, building a logging empire that had dominated the northern Oregon coast for decades. Victor had inherited the company in the 1990s and pivoted from timber to real estate development, buying up historical properties throughout the region, demolishing them, and replacing them with luxury condos and vacation rentals. He was wealthy, connected, and according to Cordelia's journal entries, ruthless. He had spent the last decade trying to acquire Thornfield Manor through every legal and extra-legal means available, offers, threats, pressure campaigns, and most disturbingly, what appeared to be an attempt to have the property condemned by bribing county officials. Cordelia had fought him off every time, alone, for 40 years. And now it was Elara's turn. She needed to know more about the man who was trying to take her inheritance. Over the next 2 days, Elara pieced together a picture of Victor Ashford from Callum's descriptions and from old newspaper clippings she found stacked in Cordelia's study. Victor was 58 years old, the third generation of Ashfords in Port Helion. His grandfather, Thomas Ashford, had founded Ashford Timber Company in 1929, building a logging empire that had dominated the northern Oregon coast for decades. Victor's father had expanded the operation, buying up mill properties and commercial real estate along the waterfront. Victor himself had inherited the company in the 1990s and pivoted from timber to real estate development, leveraging the family's extensive land holdings to build luxury condos, vacation rentals, and resort properties along the coast. He was wealthy, connected, and according to Cordelia's journal entries, that Ilara had only begun to read ruthless in a way that went far beyond aggressive business practices. He had spent the last decade trying to acquire Thornfield Manor and the surrounding acreage through every legal and extra-legal means available. Purchase offers that started generous and became threatening. Pressure campaigns directed at county officials to rezone the property or condemn the house. Anonymous complaints to building inspectors. And most disturbingly, what appeared to be a sustained effort to isolate Cordelia from the few friends and allies she had in Port Helion, creating the conditions for a forced sale or a guardianship proceeding that would have given Victor control of the estate. Cordelia had fought him off every time, alone, for 40 years. And now that burden had fallen to Ilara, who had neither Cordelia's resources nor her decades of experience in managing the Ashford threat. But she had something Cordelia had never had. At the end, she had youth, and she had nothing left to lose. When you have already lost everything, your mother, your home, your identity as a person who exists in the system, the threat of losing more carries a different weight. It is not lighter, but it is familiar. And familiarity, Ilara had learned, is a kind of armor. Over the next 2 days, Ilara maintained her distance from Callum Bride. She allowed him to work in the basement. She accepted the bottled water and camp stove he brought from his truck. She let him help her board up the remaining broken windows to keep out the freezing coastal fog. But she did not share Cordelia's letter with him. She did not show him the music box, and she did not tell him about the warning. She watched him carefully. He was competent quiet and seemed to know the house intimately, the way you know a building you have spent months inside. He pointed out structural dangers. She would have missed a section of floor in the dining room that was one heavy step from collapsing into the crawl space below a ceiling beam in the kitchen that had cracked and was being held together by nothing more than the pressure of the walls on either side. He was helpful, he was knowledgeable, and he never once pushed her for information about what Cordelia had left behind, which paradoxically made Ilara more suspicious. On the afternoon of her 4th day at Thornfield Manor, Ilara began clearing out Cordelia's study. The room was on the 1st floor, just off the main hallway, and it was the most cluttered space in the entire house. Towers of moldy books rose from the floor like stalagmites. Stacks of yellowing newspapers, some dating back to the 1970s, leaned against the walls in precarious columns. Broken porcelain figurines, empty picture frames, and bundles of old correspondence were piled on every surface. The desk itself was buried under a landslide of papers and journals, and the chair behind it had collapsed under the weight of decades of accumulated junk. It took Ilara 3 hours to clear enough space to reach the western wall, where a massive mahogany bookcase stood like a sentinel. The bookcase was water-damaged and warped, and it had clearly not been moved in years. Ilara wanted to see what was behind it. She did not have a specific reason, just a feeling, the kind of instinct you develop when you have spent months sleeping in a car and learning to read danger in small details. She called Callum up from the basement to help her move it. They each took a side and pushed. The bookcase resisted its swollen base, grinding against the floor like a ship running aground. They pushed harder. Something caught. There was a sharp, splintering crack, and a floorboard beneath the bookcase split upward, revealing a dark gap beneath. "Hold on," Callum said, breathing hard. "Let me get a pry bar." "Wait," Alara said. She dropped to her knees. The gap was not accidental. Beneath the splintered board, the floor had been deliberately cut. A rectangular void, roughly 2 feet by 1 foot, had been carved into the subfloor and lined with tin sheeting to protect whatever was inside from moisture and rodents. Alara reached into the dark space. Her fingers touched cold metal. She pulled. The object was heavy, and it took both hands to lift it free. It was a rusted iron lockbox, roughly the size of a large shoebox, secured with an antique brass padlock. Next to it, in the compartment, lay a thick, leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and dry-rotted at the edges, but still intact. Alara set the lockbox on the floor and opened the journal carefully. The pages were filled with handwriting. She recognized the same elegant, sloping cursive from the personal note in the envelope. Cordelia's hand. But steadier here, written years or decades earlier before age had stolen the precision from her fingers. She turned to the first entry. October 14th, 1982. Victor's father came again today. He stood on my porch and threatened me. He told me his family is entitled to the Sterling shares and the Hargrove gold. He doesn't understand. The wealth was never meant for the Ashfords. His father, Thomas, stole the timber rights in 1929 through forgery and intimidation. He drove my family to ruin. But he never found the physical assets because my mother was smarter than any of them. She hid the truth where the rats cannot chew and the water cannot reach. The house is the vault, and I will protect it until my last breath. Alara read the words aloud, her voice barely above a whisper in the silent, dust-choked study. She looked up at Callum, whose face had gone pale. "The Sterling shares," he said quietly. "I've heard of those. It's a local legend around here. During the bank crisis of 1929, a massive fortune-bearer bonds gold certificates, physical gold, disappeared from the founding families of Port Helion. Everyone assumed it was lost in a bank fire. There were investigations, lawsuits, conspiracy theories. Nobody ever found it. "Cordelia had it," Alara said, staring at the lockbox. "She hid it, right here under the floor." She turned more pages. The journal spanned decades. Cordelia had been documenting the Ashford family's attempts to acquire the property, offers threats, legal challenges, and worse. In one entry from 1994, Cordelia described finding evidence that Victor Ashford, who had taken over his father's development company, had been bribing county officials to condemn the property so it could be seized through eminent domain. She fought them for 40 years, Elara murmured. Alone, she turned to the last entry. The handwriting here was shaky again, the letters trembling. It was dated just 3 weeks before Cordelia's death. I have hidden the truth in 3 places, 3 keys, one in the hearth, one in the ground, one where she began. If Elara finds this journal, she will know what to do. She has her mother's stubbornness. She has my blood. She is a Hargrove even if she doesn't know it yet. The Ashfords took everything from us once. They will not take it again. Elara closed the journal. Her hands were shaking. She reached back into the compartment and pulled out one more item she had missed, a folded piece of drafting paper brittle with age. She unfolded it carefully. It was a hand-drawn floor plan of Thornfield Manor. Every room, every hallway, every staircase was rendered in meticulous detail. And in 3 locations, the main fireplace in the parlor, the family cemetery behind the house, and a 3rd spot marked only with a small star and the words, "Where she began." Cordelia had drawn small circles in red ink. 3 locations, 3 keys. Below the floor plan in Cordelia's handwriting was a final instruction. There are 3 keys. Find all 3. Only together will they open the vault. The 3rd key is not in the house. It is in the place where she began. If you are reading this, the burden is yours now. I am sorry. I tried to finish this myself. I ran out of time. Be careful. Be brave. And remember, the foundation of our family is stronger than their greed. Elara looked up at Callum. He was staring at the floor plan, his eyes wide. 3 keys, she said. 1 in the fireplace, 1 in the cemetery, and 1 somewhere I haven't figured out yet. And a vault. Callum added, his voice barely audible. Somewhere in this house, there's a vault. The air in the study felt suddenly thicker, charged with the weight of what they had found. Elara looked at the lockbox, then at the journal, then at the floor plan with its 3 red circles. Her great-aunt, her grandmother, had spent her entire life guarding a secret that powerful, dangerous people wanted. And now that secret, that burden, that inheritance belonged to an 18-year-old girl who owned nothing but a broken car, a cracked music box, and a rusted fireplace poker. Somewhere outside, a car engine rumbled up the distant driveway and then went silent. Elara walked to the study window and peered through the gap in the boards. A black Mercedes-Benz was parked at the edge of the tree line, its engine off its headlights dark. Through the windshield, barely visible in the fading afternoon light, she could see a figure sitting motionless in the driver's seat, watching, waiting. Victor Ashford had not left Port Helion. He had not given up, and he was not going to stop until he got what he believed was his. Elara stepped back from the window. She picked up the journal, the floor plan, and the lockbox. She looked at Callum, who was watching her with an expression she could not quite read, concern maybe, or calculation, or something in between. "We need to find the first key," she said. "Tonight, before he makes his next move." She did not say what she was thinking, which was the harder truth, the one that sat in her chest like a stone. Cordelia's warning had told her not to trust anyone who knew her name before she gave it. Callum had known her name. The law firm had confirmed his story, and he had been nothing but helpful for 4 days. But Cordelia had spent 40 years learning that the most dangerous enemies are the ones who look like friends. Elara clutched the journal to her chest and made a decision. She would find the 3 keys. She would open the vault. She would finish what her grandmother had started, but she would do it with her eyes open. And she would trust no one completely. Not the man in the Mercedes, not the man standing in front of her. Only herself. The first key was exactly where Cordelia's floor plan said it would be. Elara stood in front of the massive stone fireplace in the main parlor, studying the brickwork with the beam of her flashlight. The hearth was a grand, imposing structure, 6 feet wide and nearly as tall, built from rough-hewn basalt stones that had been mortared together with the kind of craftsmanship that belonged to a century when men built things to last forever. A thick oak mantelpiece, warped and split from decades of moisture, ran across the top. The firebox itself was caked with ancient soot and the papery remnants of bird nests. "The mortar," Callum said, kneeling beside her. He ran his fingers along the interior wall of the firebox, pressing gently against each joint. "Look at this section here on the left side. The color is different, lighter. This wasn't part of the original construction. Someone repointed these stones." Elara leaned in. He was right. A rectangular section of stones, roughly 18 inches wide and 12 inches tall, had been set with a mortar that was noticeably paler than the surrounding joints. The work had been done carefully, designed to blend in at a glance, but under close inspection, the difference was obvious. "Hand me the pry bar," Elara said. She worked the flat edge of the bar into the seam between 2 stones and applied pressure. The mortar crumbled easily, powdering away like dried clay. The first stone shifted. She pulled it free and set it on the hearth. Then the second, then the third. Behind the stones was a cavity that had been lined with a sheet of hammered copper green with oxidation but still intact. Inside the cavity sat a waterproof metal container roughly the size of a cigar box. Elara pulled it out. The container was sealed with a rubber gasket and a clamp mechanism that took some effort to open. The metal had corroded slightly around the seal, fusing the lid to the body. And Elara had to use the pry bar again, working the flat edge into the gap and levering gently until the seal broke with a hiss of air that smelled of nothing, dry, sterile, preserved. Whoever had sealed this container had done so with the intention of keeping its contents intact for decades, and they had succeeded. When she finally pried the lid free, she found 2 items inside. The first was a key, brass heavy, about 4 inches long, with teeth cut in an unusual pattern, not the simple notches of a standard key, but a complex arrangement of ridges and grooves that spiraled around the shaft like a helix. The second item was a bundle of documents sealed in a plastic sleeve. Alara slid them out carefully. They were old, but preserved legal papers, stock certificates, and corporate filings. She spread them on the floor and began reading by flashlight. It took her 20 minutes to understand what she was looking at. The documents were share certificates for Ashford Timber Company, the corporation that Victor Ashford's grandfather Thomas had built after allegedly stealing the timber rights from the Hargrove family in 1929. But these were not just historical records. They were transfer documents, acquisition agreements, proxy authorizations, and they told a story that was very different from the one Victor Ashford had been telling for decades. Cordelia Hargrove had not simply hidden her family's fortune and waited. She had fought back, quietly, methodically, over the course of 40 years. She had been purchasing shares in Ashford Timber Company through a series of shell corporations and proxy buyers. The transactions were small, carefully spaced, designed to avoid detection. A fraction of a percent here, a 0.5% there, year after year, decade after decade. By the time of her death, Cordelia Hargrove owned 51% of Ashford Timber Company, a controlling interest. Alara sat back on her heels, the document spread around her like a paper mosaic. She stared at the numbers, running the math in her head. Victor Ashford had built his entire development empire on the foundation of Ashford Timber. The land rights, the logging permits, the commercial zoning, all of it flowed from the original company. And Cordelia had spent 4 decades quietly buying the company out from under him. He didn't know. If he had known, he would not have been offering $25,000 for the house. He would have been offering whatever it took. Or he would have stopped offering altogether and simply taken it. "What is it?" Callum asked, watching her face. Alara hesitated. Cordelia's warning echoed in her mind. Trust no one. But she was alone in a decaying house with a fortune hidden in its walls and a predator watching from the driveway. And the practical reality was that she needed help. She told Callum about the share certificates, but she did not show him the documents. She described what they contained in general terms, enough to explain the significance, not enough to give him leverage. 51%. Callum repeated, his voice low. She owned his company. He's been building condos and vacation rentals on a foundation that doesn't belong to him. And he doesn't know it, Alara said. If we find the other 2 keys and open the vault, there might be more. Cordelia's journal mentions bearer bonds, gold certificates, property deeds. She called the house a vault for a reason. Callum was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We should move fast. If Ashford is watching the house, he's going to escalate. Men like him don't wait. They act." Alara nodded. She tucked the first brass key into the inside pocket of her hoodie, where she could feel its weight against her ribs. She put the documents back in the waterproof container and hid it beneath a loose board in the parlor, a different location from where she had found it. If someone searched the fireplace, they would find an empty cavity. Then she turned her attention to the second red circle on Cordelia's floor plan. The family cemetery. The Hargrove Cemetery occupied a small clearing at the southern edge of the property, enclosed by a wrought iron fence that had rusted into a lattice of orange and black. 4 headstones stood in a neat row, their surfaces weathered and stained with lichen. The grass around them had grown wild knee-high in some places, and the entire clearing had a hushed, sealed quality, as though the trees surrounding it had drawn close to keep the rest of the world out. Elara read the headstones by flashlight, moving from left to right. The first belonged to Ezekiel Hargrove, 1868 to 1931. Patriarch, founder. The second belonged to his wife, Adelaide Hargrove, 1872 to 1945. The third belonged to their son, Franklin Hargrove, 1895 to 1962. The fourth headstone had no name, no dates, no inscription of any kind. It was simply a blank slab of granite, the same size and shape as the others set into the ground, with the same care and permanence. But where the other stones bore the carved identities of the dead, this one offered nothing. A headstone for a ghost. According to Cordelia's floor plan, the second key was here, beneath the unnamed grave. Elara looked at the blank stone and felt something shift inside her chest. This was not like prying stones from a fireplace. This was a grave. Unnamed or not, someone had placed this marker here with intention, and the idea of digging beneath it carried a weight that had nothing to do with the physical effort involved. She and Callum worked in the dark. Elara had insisted on waiting until after midnight, when Victor's Mercedes was no longer visible at the edge of the tree line. They used a shovel and a pickaxe that Callum had retrieved from his truck, and they dug by the light of a single lantern, its flame turned low. The soil was soft coastal clay, dark and wet, laced with the roots of the surrounding Douglas firs. They dug for 40 minutes, the only sounds the rhythmic bite of the shovel and the occasional hoot of an owl in the canopy above. At roughly 3 feet down, the shovel struck metal. There was no coffin, no remains. The unnamed grave had never held a body. Instead, buried in the clay was a small steel strongbox, roughly the size of a briefcase, sealed with a combination lock that had been welded shut. Callum had to use an angle grinder from his truck to cut through it, the tool screaming in the silent night air, throwing sparks that danced like fireflies against the dark trees. Inside the strongbox were 2 items. The second brass key, identical in design to the first heavy, with the same complex helical teeth. And a photograph. The photograph was old, printed on thick paper stock that had yellowed at the edges but was otherwise well preserved. It showed a young woman, dark hair, sharp features, a guarded expression that did not quite hide the vulnerability beneath, sitting in a rocking chair on what was unmistakably the front porch of Thornfield Manor. In her arms, she held an infant wrapped in a white blanket. The woman looked directly at the camera with an intensity that made Elara's breath catch. On the back of the photograph in Cordelia's handwriting were 4 words and a date. My daughter Margaret, 1965. Elara stared at the photograph for a long time. Margaret. Cordelia had a daughter who did not appear in any legal record, any probate filing, any family document. The law firm's letter had described Cordelia as having no surviving children. The estate had been left to Elara as a great niece. But the note in the envelope had not said great niece. It had said grandmother. Elara looked at the photograph again. The young woman's face, the sharp cheekbones, the way she held her chin slightly raised as if bracing for impact. Elara knew that face. She had seen it every day of her life in a different configuration, aged by time and circumstance, but unmistakable. The woman in the photograph was her mother. Catherine Wynn's real name was Margaret Hargrove. The realization did not arrive as a sudden shock. It arrived as a slow, deep recognition, like watching a blurred image gradually come into focus. All the locked doors in her mother's past, the refusal to discuss family, the absence of grandparents at holidays, the way Catherine would sometimes stare at the music box with an expression that was not nostalgia, but grief. All of those doors swung open at once, and behind them was a single, simple truth. Catherine had run. She had changed her name, left Port Helion, left her mother, and built a new life in Portland under a false identity. She had never told Elara about Cordelia. She had never told Elara about the Hargrove family, the fortune, the house, or the war with the Ashfords. She had hidden everything, and Cordelia had let her. Your mother begged me to stay away, and I honored her wish, even though it broke my heart. Elara tried to reconstruct the timeline in her head. Margaret had been born in 1965. She had left Port Helion at some point, changed her name to Catherine, and built a new life in Portland. She had married Gerald Wynn, or at least taken his name, and had Elara late in life. Catherine had always seemed older than the other mothers at school, events, quieter, more watchful, as though she were constantly scanning for threats that no one else could see. Now Elara understood why. Catherine had spent her entire adult life running from a legacy that was too dangerous and too heavy to carry. Elara looked at the music box which she had brought to the cemetery in her backpack. She turned it over in her hands. On the underside, barely visible, worn almost smooth by decades of handling, was a single letter engraved in the wood. M. Margaret. The music box had belonged to her mother, not Catherine. Margaret, the daughter Cordelia raised in this house, on this land, in the shadow of the Ashford threat. Margaret had taken the music box when she left. It was the one piece of home she had allowed herself to keep. And somewhere inside it, according to Cordelia's floor plan, was the third key. The key hidden where she began. Elara did not open the music box that night. The third key would require dismantling the box to find whatever hidden compartment Cordelia had built into it, and Elara was not ready to destroy the last physical connection she had to her mother. Not yet. Not until she had no other choice. She tucked both brass keys into her hoodie pocket and climbed out of the grave. The night air was sharp and cold, carrying the smell of salt from the distant ocean and the turned earth of the open grave at her feet. Callum stood a few paces back, watching her with an expression she could not read in the lantern light. "You okay?" he asked. "My mother's name wasn't Catherine," Elara said. "It was Margaret. She was Cordelia's daughter. I'm not a great niece. I'm a granddaughter." Callum was quiet for a moment. "That changes the legal picture completely. If you're a direct descendant, the inheritance is ironclad. No court in Oregon would overturn a grandmother-to-granddaughter bequest. Ashford's lawyers won't be able to touch it." "I know," Elara said. And then she said something she had been thinking for 2 days but had not spoken aloud. "Callum, if Cordelia hired you 6 months ago and you've been working in this house all that time, you must have found things. Loose boards, hidden spaces, the fireplace mortar. You're a contractor. You notice details. Are you telling me you spent 6 months in this house and never found anything?" The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds, but it felt much longer. "I found the reinforced column in the basement," Callum said carefully. "The brickwork didn't match. I knew something was behind it, but Cordelia told me not to touch it, and I respected that. It was a reasonable answer. But Elara noticed that he had not answered her actual question. She had asked if he had found anything. He had told her what Cordelia had told him not to do. Those were 2 different things. She filed it away and said nothing. The next morning, Diane Ashford came to visit. Elara was sitting on the front porch eating a granola bar from the supply Callum had brought when a silver Audi sedan pulled up the driveway. The car was expensive, but understated, deliberately chosen to project a different image from Victor's aggressive black Mercedes. The woman who stepped out was in her early 50s, dressed in a tailored navy blazer and white blouse with auburn hair cut in a sharp bob. She carried a leather portfolio under one arm and wore an expression of practiced warmth that did not quite reach her eyes. "Elara, I'm Diane Ashford. I know the name probably makes you nervous, and I understand why. May I have a few minutes of your time?" Elara remained seated. "You're Victor's wife." "I am, but I'm here on my own, not on his behalf. In fact, I'm here because of his behalf." Diane climbed the porch steps, carefully testing each one. "May I sit?" Elara gestured to the railing. Diane chose to remain standing. "I'll be direct with you," Diane said, opening the leather portfolio. "Victor and I are separating. I've filed preliminary paperwork with the family court in Salem. Our marriage has been deteriorating for years, but his obsession with this property and this family's estate has pushed things past the breaking point. I'm a real estate attorney by training, and I know what he's been doing. The bribes, the pressure campaigns, the threats against your great-aunt." She paused, letting the words settle. "I came here to warn you. Victor is not going to stop. He's already contacted a judge about filing an emergency petition to have Cordelia's will invalidated on grounds of diminished mental capacity." Diane pulled a document from the portfolio and held it out. "This is a copy of a medical evaluation conducted 8 months before Cordelia's death. It shows a diagnosis of moderate cognitive decline. Victor plans to use this to argue that Cordelia was not of sound mind when she wrote the will." Elara Elara took the document and scanned it. The medical evaluation was detailed, clinical, and damning. It described memory loss, confusion, paranoid ideation, and impaired judgment. If a court accepted this document, the entire inheritance could be thrown into question. "Why are you showing me this?" Elara asked. "Because I want to help you fight it," Diane said, her voice dropping to a tone of confidential sincerity. "Victor has been using me as his legal shield for 20 years. I've drafted his contracts, filed his motions, and cleaned up his messes. I know where the bodies are buried, metaphorically speaking. If you and I work together, I can help you build a case that protects your inheritance and exposes Victor's misconduct." Elara studied Diane's face. The woman was good. Her body language was open, her eye contact steady, her voice calibrated to project vulnerability without weakness. Everything about her presentation said, "ally." "What do you want in return?" Elara asked. Diane smiled. "Just information. I need to know what Cordelia left behind: documents, assets, anything that could be used in the legal proceedings. If there's financial evidence of Victor's wrongdoing hidden in this house, it would strengthen both our positions." It was a compelling offer. Elara was 18 years old, alone, facing a legal challenge from a wealthy developer with an army of lawyers. Diane was offering expertise, insider knowledge, and a shared enemy. Every rational calculation pointed toward accepting the help. But Elara had spent 4 months on the street, and the street teaches you to read people the way a sailor reads weather, not by what they say, but by what they don't say, by the pressure systems moving beneath the surface. Diane had come alone. She had emphasized her separation from Victor. She had positioned herself as a victim and a rebel. But she had also brought a document that, if made public, could destroy Elara's inheritance. She was offering help with one hand and holding a weapon in the other. "I'll think about it," Elara said. Diane's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course. Take your time. Here's my card. Call me anytime." She placed a business card on the porch railing, turned, and walked back to her Audi with the measured stride of someone who was accustomed to getting what she wanted and was not accustomed to waiting. Elara watched the Audi pull down the driveway and disappear into the trees. She sat on the porch for another 10 minutes, turning Diane's business card over in her fingers. Then she stood up, walked to the edge of the property where the driveway met Oakhaven Drive, and looked south. There was only one road leading away from Thornfield Manor. It ran south for a 1/4 mile through the forest before intersecting with the coastal highway. From the elevated vantage point at the edge of the property, Elara could see a sliver of that intersection through the trees. Diane's silver Audi was not heading toward the highway. It was turning left onto a private road that ran parallel to the coast. Elara knew that road. Callum had pointed it out on her second day. It led to a cluster of luxury properties on the bluff overlooking the Pacific. Victor Ashford's house was on that road. Diane was not separating from Victor. She was not filing for divorce. She was not a rebel or a victim. She was a weapon deployed by her husband with the precision of a chess piece, designed to win Elara's trust and extract exactly the information Victor needed to find the fortune hidden inside Thornfield Manor. Elara tore the business card in half and let the pieces fall into the mud. That night, she could not sleep. She lay in her sleeping bag on the parlor floor, listening to the house groan and creak around her, running through the chain of events in her mind. The music box sat on the mantelpiece above her, its brass hinges catching the faint moonlight that filtered through the boarded windows. 2 keys were in her hoodie pocket, pressing against her ribs. The third was somewhere inside that box, hidden by a woman who had spent her entire life hiding things. Her mother had hidden too. Margaret Hargrove had become Catherine Wynne and fled to Portland and never looked back. She had raised Elara in a small apartment with second-hand furniture and a job that kept her out until midnight, and she had never once mentioned Cordelia or Port Helion or the fortune buried in the walls of a rotting Victorian mansion on the Oregon coast. Why? What had Margaret been running from the Ashfords? The burden of guarding the secret, or something else? Something about the Hargrove family itself that was too heavy to carry. Elara turned on her side and stared at the dying embers of the fire she had built in the parlor hearth. The coals pulsed with a deep orange glow that made the shadows on the walls seem alive. She thought about the conversation she had never had with her mother, the one that started with, "Tell me about your family," and ended somewhere she couldn't imagine. Catherine had always deflected those questions with a practiced lightness that in retrospect was neither light nor practiced, it was desperate. "It's just us, Ellie. That's all we need." And Elara, who had been a child and then a teenager and then a young woman too consumed with the ordinary emergencies of growing up to push harder, had accepted that answer the way you accept a locked door in a hallway you walk through every day. You stop seeing it. You stop wondering what's behind it. Until one day the door opens on its own and you realize that everything you thought you knew about the hallway was wrong. She thought about Cordelia's final journal entry. "She has my blood. She is a Hargrove. Blood, legacy, inheritance." These words had meant nothing to Elara a week ago. She had been a girl in a car worried about finding a job and a shower and a safe place to park. Now she was lying in a mansion that contained a fortune, holding keys to a vault she had not yet opened, and being hunted by people who would do anything to take it from her. The weight of it was staggering. Not the fortune itself, she had not yet fully comprehended the fortune, but the responsibility. Cordelia had spent 40 years protecting this secret. Margaret had spent her entire adult life running from it. And now Elara, who had owned nothing a week ago, was expected to carry the thing that had consumed both of them. She missed her mother with a ferocity that was almost physical. She wanted to ask Catherine Margaret why she had left. She wanted to ask what she had been afraid of. She wanted to ask if the music box was a gift or a burden or both. She wanted to sit on the edge of her mother's bed, the way she had when she was 12, watching Catherine apply the clear nail polish she wore to keep her nails from splitting at the warehouse, and asked the question she had never asked. "Mom, who are you? Who were you before you were mine?" But Catherine was dead, and dead people do not answer questions. They only leave them behind. Elara closed her eyes and tried to sleep. The house settled around her, whispering its ancient, incomprehensible language of stress and strain and slow decay. At exactly 2:14 in the morning, she woke up. Not because of a sound from the house, because of a sound from inside the room. A soft electronic click. The unmistakable sound of a phone camera shutter. Elara opened her eyes but did not move. She kept her breathing slow, her body still, her face turned toward the wall. In the faint glow of the dying fire, she could see a shadow moving near the mantelpiece. A human shadow. Someone was standing at the mantelpiece holding a phone. The screen cast a pale blue glow across their features. It was Callum. He was photographing the floor plan. Cordelia's hand-drawn map of Thornfield Manor, with its 3 red circles, was spread on the mantelpiece where Elara had left it to study before bed. Callum was standing over it, his phone held steady, capturing image after image. His face in the phone light was concentrated, focused, stripped of the easy warmth he had worn every day since they met. This was a different face, a working face, the face of a man completing a task he had been assigned. Elara watched him for 30 seconds. She watched him photograph the map from multiple angles. She watched him open the journal that sat next to the map and flip to the last entry, the one that described the 3 keys and the vault. She watched him photograph that too. Then she sat up. Callum froze. The phone screen went dark. For a moment, neither of them moved. "How much is he paying you?" Elara asked. Her voice was flat, drained of everything except exhaustion. Callum did not pretend. He did not offer an excuse or a justification. He stood there in the dark, his phone still in his hand, and answered. 50,000. He approached me before Cordelia died. She was getting weaker, and he knew she'd leave the house to someone. He wanted a man inside, someone she trusted, someone who could search the house without raising suspicion. "So you were never working for Cordelia?" "No, I was working for Cordelia. She hired me. The work was real, but Ashford got to me after. Offered me more money than I'd make in 2 years of contracting. I needed it. I had debts. I said yes." Elara stood up. She was shaking, but not from cold. "Did you report back to him about the fireplace? About the cemetery?" "No, not yet. I was going to. That's what I was doing just now, getting the photos to send." "But you hadn't sent them yet." "No." Elara crossed the room and held out her hand. "Give me the phone." Callum hesitated. Then he placed the phone in her palm. She opened the photo gallery, found the images of the map and journal, and deleted them. Then she checked his text messages. There was a thread with a contact labeled VA. 3 messages, all from Victor, all asking variations of the same question. Have you found anything yet? Callum had not replied to any of them. Elara set the phone on the mantelpiece. She picked up the map, the journal, and the 2 brass keys. She put them in her backpack and zipped it shut. Cordelia warned me about you, Elara said. Not by name, but she knew someone would come. Someone who would know my name before I gave it. Someone who would seem helpful. Elara, listen to me. I know how this looks, but I haven't given Ashford anything. Not a word. I was going to, yes. But every day I spent in this house, every day I read what Cordelia wrote. Every day I watched you fight for something you didn't even understand, yet it got harder. She treated me like I mattered. No one does that. Not for a guy like me. I'm a contract worker. I show up, I do the job, I leave. Nobody asks how I'm doing. Nobody cares about my story. Cordelia did. She asked me about my family, about where I grew up, about what kind of house I'd build if I could build anything in the world. And when I told her I'd build something that would last, something my grandchildren could grow up in, she looked at me and said, "Then you understand why I need you to protect this one." And I said I would, and I meant it. And then Victor waved $50,000 in my face, and I forgot what I meant. Get out. Elara. Get out of my house, Callum. Leave the key on the mantelpiece. Don't come back. He stood there for a moment longer, his face half lit by the dying fire, a battleground of guilt and something that might have been genuine regret. Then he reached into his pocket, placed the brass key Cordelia had given him on the mantelpiece, and walked out of the parlor without another word. The front door scraped open and then closed. A truck engine started in the driveway. Headlights swept across the boarded windows. And then he was gone. Elara stood alone in the parlor of Thornfield Manor, her backpack clutched against her chest, listening to the silence that rushed in to fill the space Callum had occupied. The fire died down to its last ember, and the darkness pressed in from every corner of the room. She was alone, truly, completely alone. No allies, no backup, no one she could trust. And Victor Ashford was still out there watching, waiting, and running out of patience. The answer to when Victor would make his move came at dawn. Elara was in the kitchen heating water on the camp stove for instant coffee when she heard the sound. Not a car engine, not footsteps. Something heavier, more deliberate, more violent. A sledgehammer hitting wood. The sound came from the front of the house, a massive percussive boom that shook the walls and sent dust cascading from the kitchen ceiling. Then another, and another. Each impact was followed by the splintering shriek of wood giving way. Elara grabbed the fireplace poker and ran into the hallway. The front door, the heavy oak door that she and Callum had spent an hour reinforcing with plywood and 2x4s, was being destroyed. With each blow, the center panel cracked, further daylight lancing through the fractures in sharp white beams. The final blow sent the door crashing inward, the plywood splintering, the 2x4s snapping like kindling. Standing in the doorframe silhouetted by the gray morning light was a man built like a shipping container, easily 6'4", 260 pounds, with a shaved head and hands the size of dinner plates. He held the sledgehammer casually as though it were a walking stick. Behind him, stepping over the debris with the careful precision of a man who did not like getting his shoes dirty, was Victor Ashford. He was dressed in the same charcoal suit, the same Italian leather shoes, the same expression of cold proprietary entitlement. Beside him was Diane, her blazer replaced by a dark overcoat, her face stripped of its earlier pretense of warmth. Two more men flanked them, younger, harder, wearing work clothes and carrying crowbars. 4 against 1. "Good morning, Alara," Victor said, his voice carrying the same false congeniality he had used on the first day, but thinner now, stretched tight over something raw and desperate underneath. "I believe we have unfinished business." "You're trespassing," Alara said, gripping the poker. Her voice was steady, but her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. Victor stepped further into the foyer, his shoes crunching on the plaster debris from the shattered door. He surveyed the interior of the house with the practiced eye of a man who assessed properties for a living, calculating square footage and structural potential and demolition costs. But there was something else in his gaze, something hungry, almost feral, the look of a man who had been wanting something for so long that the wanting had become the defining feature of his personality. "Trespassing is a civil matter," Diane said, her attorney voice clicking into place like a loaded chamber. "And given that we've filed an emergency motion to contest the validity of Cordelia Hargrove's will on grounds of diminished capacity, the ownership of this property is currently in legal dispute. Until a court rules otherwise, Victor has as much right to be here as you do." It was a lie. A brazen, calculated lie designed to create enough doubt to justify what they were about to do. No court had ruled. No motion had been granted. They were banking on the fact that an 18-year-old homeless girl would not know the difference. But Alara did know the difference. She had spent weeks in the Portland Library reading about tenant rights property law and eviction procedures, because when you live in a car, understanding the law is a survival skill. She had read about adverse possession and quiet title actions and the difference between civil and criminal trespass. She had read about probate timelines and will contests and the legal standard for testamentary capacity in the state of Oregon. She had done this not because she had any expectation of inheriting property, but because knowledge was free and ignorance was expensive, and she had already paid too much for the latter. "No court has granted your motion," Alara said. "I'm the named beneficiary in a valid notarized will. This is my property. You are trespassing, and anything you take from this house is theft." Victor's mask slipped. The false smile vanished, replaced by a look of naked, trembling fury. "Your grandmother was a senile, paranoid old woman who spent 50 years squatting on a fortune that belongs to my family. My grandfather built this town. He built the logging company. He built the economy that kept these people fed. And Cordelia Hargrove stole from him and hid the evidence in this rotting pile of timber. Your grandfather was a forger and a thief, Elara said. Cordelia's journal documents every lie, every bribe, every stolen deed, and she spent 40 years buying back what he stole. She owns your company, Victor. 51%. I have the certificates. The silence that followed was absolute. Victor's face went white. Diane's eyes widened. For 3 full seconds, nobody in the room moved or spoke. Then Victor turned to the man with the sledgehammer. Kovac, find the documents. Tear the house apart if you have to. Kovac stepped forward, raising the sledgehammer. Elara did not run toward the basement. She could not. Kovac was between her and the hallway that led to the basement door. Instead, she ran deeper into the house through the kitchen, past the pantry, into the servants' corridor that ran along the eastern wall. Behind her, she heard Kovac's heavy boots on the hardwood, heard Victor shouting orders to the other men, heard Diane's heels clicking on the floor like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. The servants' corridor was narrow and dark, barely wide enough for one person. Elara sprinted through it, the backpack bouncing against her spine, the fireplace poker still clutched in her right hand. She burst through a door at the far end and found herself in the dining room, the one with the compromised floor that Callum had warned her about. She could hear Kovac behind her, his massive frame scraping against the narrow walls of the corridor. She had maybe 10 seconds. Elara looked at the dining room floor. The section near the center was visibly sagging, the boards discolored and soft with rot. Callum had told her it was one heavy step from collapsing into the crawl space below. She sprinted around the perimeter of the room, hugging the wall where the joists were still supported, and exited through the far door, just as Kovac burst into the dining room. He did not hug the wall. The floor held for his first step. It held for his second. On his third step, a sound like a gunshot split the air as the rotted joist beneath his foot snapped in half. Kovac plunged through the floor up to his waist, the sledgehammer clattering away across the tilting boards, his legs dangling in the crawl space below. He roared with pain and fury, clawing at the broken edges of the hole, but his massive frame was wedged tight. Elara did not stop to look. She ran through the hallway, past the staircase, past the parlor, and reached the narrow door near the pantry that led to the basement stairs. She threw it open, plunged down the steep wooden steps, and slammed the heavy iron door at the bottom shut behind her. The deadbolt, a massive old-fashioned mechanism that Callum had oiled and tested during his restoration work, slid home with a satisfying clang. She was in the basement. She was alone, and the door would hold for now. But Victor's voice, muffled but audible through the floorboards above, issued a command that turned Elara's blood to ice. She's in the basement. She can't get out. There's no other exit. Burn it. Burn the whole thing. Smoke her out. Within minutes, Elara smelled it. Smoke. Thin, at first acrid and chemical, they were using an accelerant, probably gasoline, from a jerry can. The smoke seeped through the gaps in the floorboards above, drifting down into the basement in pale gray tendrils that caught the beam of her flashlight. Above her, through the heavy iron door and the ceiling of pipes and joists, she could hear the fire taking hold. It was not the roaring, dramatic sound that movies portray. It was a whisper, a dry, hungry whisper, like the sound of paper being crumpled, very slowly, very steadily, growing louder by increments so small that you could not identify the exact moment when it stopped being background noise and became a threat. But the smoke was not subtle. The smoke was immediate and aggressive, dropping from the ceiling in waves pooling along the floor, filling the basement the way water fills a swimming pool from the bottom up, relentlessly, indifferently. Elara pressed her back against the cold brick of the basement wall and forced herself to think. The basement was large, perhaps 60 feet by 40, with a dirt floor, thick brick support pillars, and a ceiling of exposed pipes and joists. The air was damp and cold, but the smoke was getting thicker, sinking toward the floor the way smoke does in an enclosed space. She pulled the collar of her hoodie up over her nose and mouth, but the fabric was thin, and the smoke found its way through the weave and into her lungs with a chemical sharpness that made her eyes water and her throat constrict. She had 2 keys. She had the map. She had the journal. But she did not have the 3rd key. She pulled the map from her backpack and studied it by flashlight. The 3 red circles, one in the fireplace found, one in the cemetery found, and the 3rd marked with a star and the words, "Where she began." Where she began. Elara had assumed this referred to a location, a place, the house or the town or some spot connected to Margaret's childhood. But now, in the smoke-filling darkness of the basement, her mind racing against the clock of breathable air, the phrase rearranged itself in her head. Not where Margaret began as a person, where Margaret began as a daughter. The music box, the one possession Catherine had kept from her life as Margaret. The first gift, the first connection, the first object that linked mother to daughter to grandmother. Cordelia had not hidden the 3rd key in a location. She had hidden it in an object she knew Margaret would never throw away, no matter how far she ran. The music box was in Elara's backpack. She had been carrying the 3rd key for 18 years without knowing it. But the music box was delicate, and whatever compartment Cordelia had built into it would require careful disassembly. Elara could not do that here, not in a smoke-filled basement with a fire growing above her head. She needed to get out. She swept the flashlight beam across the basement, searching for an exit that did not involve going back up the stairs into a burning house. The brick walls were solid. The windows were narrow slits at ground level, far too small to crawl through. The ceiling was a maze of pipes and ductwork, and then the beam landed on something she had overlooked. In the far corner of the basement, behind the largest support pillar, the brick wall had a section that was different from the rest. Not in color and texture. The bricks here were smoother, more uniformly shaped, and the mortar between them was slightly recessed. It was the kind of subtle difference that only someone who had spent time studying the brickwork of this house would notice. It was the kind of difference a contractor doing structural reinforcement work would notice. Callum had mentioned the reinforced column. He had mentioned Cordelia's obsession with the central pillar. But he had also spent 6 months working in this basement, and Ilara suddenly understood what he had actually been doing down here. Not just reinforcing beams, not just shoring up the foundation. He had been building an escape route. Cordelia had hired him to construct a tunnel. Ilara ran to the corner and pressed against the bricks. The section shifted. Not the entire wall, just a panel roughly 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall, set on a concealed hinge. She pushed harder, and the panel swung outward, revealing a narrow, rough-hewn passage cut into the earth. The walls were lined with plywood sheeting and supported by timber frames.
The floor was packed dirt. The air that flowed from the passage was cold and damp and clean, free of smoke.
Ilara did not hesitate. She ducked into the passage, pulling the brick panel shut behind her, and ran. The tunnel was roughly 40 yards long, running at a slight upward angle. It smelled of fresh-cut lumber and wet clay. The walls were close, barely 18 inches of clearance on either side of her shoulders, and the ceiling was low enough that she had to crouch as she moved her backpack, scraping against the plywood sheeting above. The flashlight beam bounced wildly as she ran, throwing shadows that leaped and twisted in the confined space. Behind her, muffled by the earth and the brick panel, she could hear the distant rhythmic thudding of someone, probably Victor's remaining men, pounding on the basement door. The tunnel was not perfectly straight. It curved slightly to the left about halfway through, following what Ilara guessed was the contour of the hillside, and at the bend she could see where the construction quality shifted. The first half of the tunnel was professionally braced, with evenly spaced timber frames and carefully fitted plywood. The second half was rougher, the frames unevenly spaced, the plywood replaced in some sections by raw earth, reinforced with chicken wire and spray foam. Callum had been building this tunnel under time
Pressure, working from both ends, and the quality reflected the urgency. But it held. The walls did not collapse. The ceiling did not sag. And the air that flowed through the passage was cold and damp and clean, blessedly, miraculously free of smoke.
At the far end, a wooden ladder led up to a hatch made of plywood and corrugated tin. Ilara climbed the ladder, pushed the hatch open with both hands, and emerged into the forest, gasping in the clean, cold coastal air. The morning light was gray and flat, filtered through the canopy of Douglas firs, and it hit her face like a benediction. She was behind the house at the edge of the tree line, roughly 100 yards from the rear of the property. The ground beneath her feet was soft with pine needles and morning dew, and the air tasted of salt and wood smoke, the salt from the Pacific, invisible but ever present beyond the bluff, and the smoke from her burning house rising through the canopy in a gray column that bent eastward in the coastal breeze. Through the trees, she could see smoke rising from Thornfield Manor. Not from the roof, not yet, but from the first-floor windows, gray and thick against the morning sky. In the distance, she heard sirens, and standing at the mouth of the tunnel, waiting for her with his phone in one hand and blood running from a cut above his left eye, was Callum Bride. He did not speak. He held up the phone, and Ilara could see on the screen a recording app, its timer still running. 47 minutes of audio.
I went back.
Callum said. His voice was hoarse. After you threw me out, I drove to Victor's house and told him I had the photos, told him you found the keys. He invited me in. I recorded everything. His plan to break into the house, his order to Kovac, his instructions to Diane about the fake medical evaluation, and his admission that he's been laundering money through Ashford Development for 15 years. He held the phone out to Ilara.
I also called the fire department and the state police. They're 3 minutes out.
Ilara stared at the phone, at the recording timer, at the blood on Callum's face. Kovac caught me as I was leaving Victor's house, Callum said. He figured out what I was doing, got one good hit in before I made it to my truck. The sirens were louder now, close enough that Ilara could see the flash of red and blue lights through the trees at the far end of Oakhaven Drive. She took the phone from Callum's hand. Then she looked back at the house. Her house, her grandmother's house, the house that held a fortune in its walls and a century of secrets in its foundation, and watched the smoke curl upward into the gray Oregon sky. 2 keys in her pocket, the third in a music box in her backpack, and a recording that could bring down the man who had spent his entire life trying to steal what the Hargrove women had spent their entire lives protecting. Ilara turned back to Callum. He stood there, swaying slightly from the blow to his head, blood drying on his temple. His phone now in her hands, his betrayal and his redemption sitting side by side like 2 stones on a scale. She did not thank him. She did not forgive him. That would come later, or it would not come at all. Right now, there was only one thing that mattered. The fire, she said. Will the basement survive?
Callum nodded slowly. The central column is reinforced steel under the brick veneer. The floor joists around it are treated and fire-rated. I built it that way on purpose. Cordelia's instructions. The upper floors might burn, but the foundation will hold.
The foundation, Ilara repeated. The foundation of our family is stronger than their greed. She gripped the backpack straps, feeling the weight of the music box against her spine, and walked toward the sirens. The fire trucks arrived first. 2 engines from the Port Helion Volunteer Fire Department came screaming up Oakhaven Drive, their red and blue lights slicing through the gray morning fog like surgical instruments. Behind them, 2 Oregon State Police cruisers, their sirens wailing in a pitch that scattered the crows from the Douglas firs and sent them wheeling across the smoke-stained sky in ragged black circles. Ilara stood at the edge of the tree line, her backpack pressed against her chest, watching the firefighters pour from the trucks
and begin unrolling hoses with the practiced urgency of men who had done this 100 times before. The smoke pouring from Thornfield Manor had thickened in the minutes since she had emerged from the tunnel, shifting from pale gray to a darker, more ominous shade that carried the acrid chemical stink of gasoline-fed flame. The first-floor windows on the eastern side of the house were glowing with an orange light that pulsed like a heartbeat. But the house was not fully engulfed. Not yet. The fire had spread from the front hallway, where Victor's men had set it, consuming the dry, rotted wallpaper and the antique furniture draped in dust sheets. But it had not yet reached the staircase or the structural supports. The building was fighting back, not because old wood resists fire, but because Callum's reinforcement work had created barriers. The treated beams, the fire-rated joists, the steel core column in the basement. Cordelia had planned for this. She had known with the paranoid foresight of a woman who had spent 40 years under siege that someone might try to burn her house down. A state trooper approached Ilara. He was tall, mid-40s, with a square jaw and the kind of calm, measured demeanor that comes from years of responding to situations where other people are panicking. "Ma'am, are you the property owner?" "Yes, my name is Ilara Wynn. This is my house. The men who set the fire are inside or nearby. Their names are Victor Ashford and his wife, Diane Ashford." Victor gave the order to burn the building while I was locked in the basement. His associate, a man called Kovac, broke down the front door with a sledgehammer. There were 2 other men with them. I don't know their names. The trooper's expression shifted. He had arrived expecting an accidental fire in an abandoned property. The specificity of Ilara's account, delivered with the flat, controlled precision of someone who had been preparing for this moment, recalibrated his entire assessment. "Do you have evidence of what you're describing?" Ilara held up Callum's phone. Audio recording, 47 minutes. Victor Ashford discussing his plan to break into the house, ordering the fire, and admitting to money laundering through his development company. The recording was made by Callum Bride, a contractor who was working as an informant for Ashford but turned. "He's over there." She pointed to Callum, who was sitting on the ground near the tunnel exit, holding a blood-soaked rag against the cut above his eye. The trooper looked at the phone, then at Callum, then at the burning house. He keyed his radio and called for additional units. Within 20 minutes, the situation had transformed from a house fire into a crime scene. The firefighters contained the blaze within the first hour. The eastern wing of the first floor was heavily damaged. The foyer, the hallway, and the dining room where Kovac had crashed through the floor were gutted, their interiors reduced to charred framing and ash. The parlor where Ilara had slept was scorched but still standing. The staircase was partially collapsed. The second and third floors had sustained heavy smoke damage but had not burned. The basement was intact. Callum had been right. The central column with its reinforced steel core concealed beneath the brick veneer had held. The fire-rated joists surrounding it had resisted the flames long enough for the firefighters to knock the blaze down before it reached the foundation. The tunnel exit hidden in the tree line was undamaged. Victor Ashford was found in his Mercedes parked on the private road a quarter-mile south of the property. He had been attempting to drive away when the state police cruisers blocked the road. Diane was in the passenger seat, her leather portfolio on her lap, her face the color of wet plaster. Kovac was extracted from the hole in the dining room floor by firefighters cursing and bleeding from a gash on his thigh where a broken joist had cut through his pants. The two other men were caught on foot, running through the forest toward the coastal highway. All 5 were arrested. Victor screamed the entire time. Not the articulate, controlled fury of a businessman defending his position, but the raw, unhinged shrieking of a man watching his entire world collapse in real time. He screamed about his grandfather. He screamed about his legacy. He screamed that Cordelia Hargrove was a thief and a liar, and that the fortune in the house belonged to his family. He screamed that his grandfather had built this town, that his father had kept it alive, that 3 generations of Ashfords had poured their blood and their money into Port Helion, while the Hargroves had squatted in their rotting mansion like parasites, feeding on the corpse of a fortune that was never theirs to begin with. He screamed until a trooper put him in the back of a cruiser and closed the door, reducing his voice to a muffled, impotent vibration against the glass. Diane said nothing. She sat in the back of a separate cruiser with her hands cuffed in front of her and stared straight ahead with an expression that was not shock or fear, but calculation. The look of a woman already constructing her defense, already identifying which pieces of evidence she could challenge and which relationships she could leverage. She would need a very good lawyer. She would need several. Elara watched them being driven away. She stood in the driveway of Thornfield Manor, her hoodie streaked with soot, her hair matted with sweat and tunnel dirt, the backpack still clutched against her chest. The firefighters moved around her, rolling up hoses, checking for hot spots, speaking into radios. The state troopers cordoned off the property with yellow tape. And then it was quiet, not silent. The forest was full of sounds, the dripping of water from the hoses, the settling groans of the damaged house, the distant crash of waves on the coastal rocks below the bluff. But the human noise had stopped. The sirens, the shouting, the hammering, the violence, all of it had drained away, leaving behind a stillness that felt almost sacred. Elara sat down on the wet gravel of the driveway. She set the backpack on the ground in front of her and opened it. She reached inside and pulled out the music box. It was undamaged. The walnut case was warm from being pressed against her back during the run through the tunnel. The brass hinges were intact. She opened the lid, and the tiny cylinder began to rotate, playing the melody she had heard 1,000 times, the lullaby from another century, the song her mother had listened to every night, the thread of sound that connected 3 generations of Hargrove women across decades of silence and separation and loss. Elara listened to the melody play through twice. Then she closed the lid and turned the box over in her hands. The 3rd key was inside this box. Cordelia had hidden it here because she knew with the certainty of a woman who understood the bonds between mothers and daughters that Margaret would never abandon this object. No matter how far she ran, no matter how completely she erased her past, Margaret would keep the music box. And if Margaret kept the music box, then whatever daughter she raised would eventually inherit it. The key would travel with the bloodline, an invisible inheritance, nested inside the visible one. Elara examined the bottom of the box. The wood was smooth, worn by decades of handling, but when she pressed her thumbnail along the edge, she felt a seam, a hairline crack that ran in a perfect rectangle, roughly 2 inches by 3 inches, near the center of the base. A hidden panel. She needed something thin and flat to pry it open. She looked around the driveway and found a small nail dropped by the firefighters lying in the gravel. She picked it up and worked the point into the seam.
The panel resisted, held in place by tiny brass pins that had corroded slightly with age. Elara applied gentle, steady pressure, working the nail along the seam, loosening each pin in sequence. She was careful, patient. The music box was the last thing her mother had touched, the last object that carried the warmth of Catherine's hands, and Elara would not break it. The panel came free with a soft click. Beneath it was a shallow compartment lined with the same velvet as the interior of the box, and resting in the compartment wrapped in a strip of oilcloth was the third brass key. Elara held it up. It was identical to the other 2, heavy about 4 inches long, with the same complex helical teeth that spiraled around the shaft. She pulled the other 2 keys from her hoodie pocket and held all 3 in her palm. They were warm from her body heat, and together they had a satisfying weight, a solidity that seemed disproportionate to their size. 3 keys, found in a fireplace, a grave, and a music box, hidden by a woman who had spent her entire life preparing for a day she would not live to see. Elara put the keys in her pocket, replaced the panel on the music box, and stood up. The basement was waiting. The state trooper in charge, his name was Sergeant Decker, initially refused to let Elara back into the house. It was an active crime scene, structurally compromised, and the fire marshal had not yet cleared it for entry. "There is something in the basement that will explain everything," Elara told him. "The reason Ashford wanted this property, the reason he set the fire, the evidence that proves my family's claims going back to 1929. It's in the foundation. I can show you." Sergeant Decker studied her for a long moment. She was 18, covered in soot, and had been trapped in a burning building less than 2 hours ago. But her eyes were steady, and her voice carried a conviction that was difficult to dismiss. "I'll go with you," he said, "and if anything looks structurally unsafe, we come back out immediately." They entered through the servants' entrance at the rear of the house, which had escaped the worst of the fire. The hallway was dark and heavy with the smell of wet char, the aftermath of fire suppression, where water and ash combine into a thick, choking miasma. The floor was slick with runoff. The walls were stained with soot. The basement door was still locked from the inside. Elara unlocked the deadbolt, and they descended the steep wooden stairs into the darkness below. The basement was cold and damp, and the air had a mineral quality to it. The smell of earth and old brick, and the faint metallic tang of groundwater seeping through the foundation. Elara's flashlight cut through the gloom, sweeping across the dirt floor, the timber supports, and the network of pipes overhead. The central column stood exactly where it had always stood, a massive pillar of dark, irregular bricks, roughly 4 feet in diameter, rising from a concrete footing to the floor above. It was the structural heart of the house, the single column that bore the greatest load, and Cordelia had protected it accordingly. Elara approached the pillar and ran her hands over the surface, brushing away cobwebs and dust. She found the section she was looking for on the eastern face, roughly at chest height. A rectangular area where the brickwork changed pattern. The rest of the pillar was laid in running bond bricks, stacked in simple, staggered rows. But this section, roughly 3 feet wide and 2 feet tall, was laid in Flemish bond, alternating stretchers and headers, a more complex pattern that created a distinct visual rhythm. Within the Flemish bond section, one brick had a circular indentation in its face, perfectly centered, roughly the diameter of a quarter. Decades of dust and cobwebs had filled the depression, making it invisible to a casual glance. But Elara had the floor plan, and she had 3 keys, and she was done waiting. She brushed the dust from the indentation and examined it closely. It was not a simple keyhole. There were 3 circular depressions arranged in a triangular pattern, each one slightly different in diameter. 3 keyholes, 3 keys. Elara inserted the first key, the one from the fireplace, into the topmost depression. It slid in with a smooth, precise fit. She turned it clockwise. A muffled click sounded from somewhere deep within the pillar. She inserted the second key, the one from the cemetery, into the lower left depression. Another smooth fit. Another clockwise turn. Another click, deeper this time, resonating through the brick. She inserted the third key, the one from the music box, the one she had carried for 18 years, into the lower right depression. It fit. She turned it. For a moment, nothing happened. The basement was silent except for the dripping of water from the pipes above. Then the sound began, a deep metallic grinding like gears engaging after decades of dormancy. The sound came from inside the pillar, from behind the bricks, from somewhere in the mechanical guts of a mechanism that had been built to outlast the people who created it. The grinding grew louder, accompanied by the heavy clank of bolts retracting, and then the entire Flemish bond section of the pillar shifted. It moved outward toward Elara with a slow pneumatic sigh, as though the house itself were exhaling. The section was not brick at all. It was a steel door 3 inches thick, faced with a brick veneer so perfectly matched that it was indistinguishable from the surrounding masonry. The door swung open on concealed hinges, revealing a dark cavity within the hollow core of the pillar. Sergeant Decker, standing behind Alara, let out a low, involuntary sound, something between a whisper and a prayer. Alara pointed her flashlight into the vault. The interior was roughly 6 feet tall and 4 feet in diameter, a cylinder of reinforced steel climate, sealed with shelves welded into the walls at regular intervals. The air inside was cool and dry, remarkably preserved, free of the dampness and decay that had consumed the rest of the house. On the upper shelves, arranged with meticulous care, were sealed glass jars, heavy, thick-walled vessels with rubber gasketed lids. Through the glass, Alara could see what was inside. Gold. Raw gold bullion poured into rough ingot shapes, each one roughly the size of a brick. There were at least 20 jars, and each one contained 2 or 3 ingots. The gold caught her flashlight beam and threw it back in warm, amber reflections that danced across the walls of the vault like liquid fire. On the middle shelves were stacks of paper, thick, heavy documents bound in leather portfolios and sealed in waterproof plastic sleeves. Alara pulled one out and opened it. Bearer bonds. Original 1920s gold certificates issued by the Port Helion National Bank. Each one signed and notarized, each one representing a claim on physical gold reserves that had supposedly been destroyed in the bank fire of 1929. They were completely untraceable bearer instruments, payable to whoever held them. On the lower shelves were legal documents. Alara pulled these out one by one, spreading them on the dirt floor of the basement while Sergeant Decker watched in stunned silence. Property deeds, dozens of them, filed with the Clatsop County Recorder's Office, signed and witnessed dating from the 1890s through the 1920s. They documented the Hargrove family's ownership of commercial properties throughout downtown Port Helion, the waterfront, the main street, the Mill District. Properties that Victor Ashford's company had been developing for decades, building luxury condos and vacation rentals on land they had leased from the county, under the assumption that the original owners were long dead and the original deeds were lost. The deeds were not lost. They were here in a steel vault, inside a brick pillar in the basement of a burning house, exactly where Cordelia Hargrove had put them. And beneath the property deeds on the very bottom shelf was one final item. A large leather-bound ledger, its cover embossed with the seal of the Port Helion National Bank, and the date 1929. Alara opened it. The ledger documented the bank's holdings at the time of the Fire Gold Reserve's bond inventories, property titles, and depositor accounts. But it also contained something else, something that made Alara's hands go still. Attached to the inside cover of the ledger, held in place by a wax seal, was a signed confession. The handwriting was different from Cordelia's. It was older, more formal, written in the heavy-handed script of a man who had been educated in a one-room schoolhouse at the turn of the century. The confession was signed by Ezekiel Hargrove, Cordelia's father, the family patriarch, the man buried in the first grave in the family cemetery. Alara read the confession slowly, her flashlight beam trembling slightly against the page. Ezekiel Hargrove confessed that on the night of November 12th, 1929, he had set fire to the Port Helion National Bank. He had done it to destroy the evidence of Thomas Ashford's forgery, the falsified transfer documents that Ashford had used to steal the Hargrove timber rights. But the fire had not been surgical. It had spread beyond the records room, consuming the entire building, destroying the life savings of dozens of families in Port Helion, and killing a night watchman named Samuel Cross, who had been asleep in the bank's back office. Ezekiel had committed arson. A man had died. The families of Port Helion had suffered devastating financial losses. And in the chaos that followed, while the town was reeling from the destruction, Ezekiel had gathered his family's physical assets, the gold, the bonds, the deeds, and hidden them. First in a series of caches around the property, and later as Cordelia grew older and took over the guardianship in the vault inside the central pillar. The Hargrove fortune was not clean. It was built on a foundation of fire and death, just as the Ashford fortune was built on a foundation of forgery and theft. Both families had committed crimes. Both families had covered their tracks. And Cordelia had spent her entire life protecting a legacy that was as much shame as it was wealth. Elara set the confession down on the dirt floor. She sat back on her heels and stared at it. She understood now why her mother had run. Margaret had discovered the truth. Perhaps she had found the confession. Perhaps Cordelia had told her, and she had chosen to leave rather than spend her life guarding a secret that was soaked in blood. She had changed her name, moved to Portland, married a man named Wynne, and raised a daughter in deliberate, complete ignorance of the Hargrove legacy. She had chosen silence over inheritance. She had chosen a clean, small life over a rich, tainted one. And now that choice had been handed back to Elara, who was sitting in a basement in a half-burned house with gold on the shelves above her and a dead man's confession in her lap. The question was not whether the fortune was hers. Legally, it was. The bearer bonds, the gold, the property deeds, the controlling interest in Ashford timber. All of it belonged to Elara Wynne, granddaughter of Cordelia Hargrove, direct descendant, sole beneficiary. The question was what she would do with the truth. She could hide the confession, destroy it. Let the narrative remain simple. The Ashfords were the villains, the Hargroves were the victims, and the fortune was righteous. No one would ever know. The night watchman Samuel Cross had died nearly a century ago. His family, if they still existed, had long since moved on. The depositors who lost their savings in the bank fire were dead. The suffering Ezekiel had caused was ancient history buried under layers of time and indifference. Or she could do what Cordelia had never done, what Margaret had fled rather than face. She could tell the truth, all of it. Elara sat in the cold, damp basement of Thornfield Manor, surrounded by gold and secrets, and thought about the people who had shaped her life.
She thought about Cordelia, who had spent 89 years guarding a fortune and a secret never able to let go of either one. She thought about Margaret, who had walked away from both and built a life on the only foundation she trusted, the truth of her own identity, however small and anonymous. She thought about Gerald, who had stolen insurance money and changed the locks. She thought about Victor, who had spent decades trying to steal what he believed was his birthright. She thought about Diane, who had weaponized trust. She thought about Callum, who had been paid to betray her and had instead betrayed the man who was paying him. Every one of them had built their lives on lies or on secrets, which are just lies that no one has uncovered yet. And every one of them had eventually been crushed by the weight of what they were hiding. She thought about what her mother would have wanted. And she realized with a clarity that surprised her that she already knew the answer. Margaret had not run from the fortune. Margaret had run from the lie. She had looked at the confession and the gold and the generations of silence, and she had decided that no amount of money was worth the cost of carrying a dead man's shame. She had chosen to start over with nothing rather than inherit everything with a secret attached. Margaret had been right, and Elara was going to finish what her mother had started not by running, but by standing still and telling the truth. The decision arrived not as a dramatic revelation, but as a quiet certainty, the way dawn arrives not all at once, but in slow, steady increments of light that eventually make the darkness impossible to sustain. Elara had spent 4 months living in a car because a man named Gerald had lied about insurance money and stolen what wasn't his. She had spent a week in a house where a man named Victor had lied about ownership and tried to steal what wasn't his. She had been lied to by Diane, who had pretended to be an ally. She had been lied to by Callum, who had pretended to be trustworthy. Her entire life, as far back as she could remember, had been shaped by lies, lies told by others, lies maintained through silence, lies passed down from one generation to the next, like a hereditary disease. She would not add to the pile. She gathered the confession, the ledger, the bearer bonds, the property deeds, and the share certificates. She carried them up the basement stairs, through the smoke-damaged hallway, and out into the gray morning light, where Sergeant Decker was waiting with 2 detectives from the state police. "There's more in the vault," Elara said, setting the documents on the hood of the nearest cruiser. "Gold bullion and additional financial instruments. I want a full inventory conducted under police supervision, and I want this included in the record." She placed Ezekiel Hargrove's confession on top of the stack. "My great-grandfather started the bank fire in 1929. A man died. Families lost their savings. This confession documents what happened. I'm not hiding it." The detectives looked at the confession, then at Elara, then at each other. One of them started to speak, but Sergeant Decker held up a hand. "You understand that disclosing this could complicate your claim to the estate," Decker said carefully. "If the assets in that vault were obtained through or protected by criminal activity, there could be legal challenges, clawback provisions, civil suits from the descendants of the affected families. "I understand," Elara said. "You could lose a significant portion of the inheritance." "I know." Decker studied her for a long moment. He had been a law enforcement officer for 22 years. He had seen people lie to protect fortunes a fraction of this size. He had seen people destroy evidence, intimidate witnesses, and burn buildings to the ground to keep their money. He was looking at an 18-year-old girl who had been sleeping in a car a week ago, who was now standing in front of a multi-million-dollar fortune and who was voluntarily handing over evidence that could reduce that fortune by half. "All right," he said. "We'll process it all." He paused, and then he did something that Elara would remember for a very long time. He extended his hand. "For what it's worth," he said, "I've been doing this job for 22 years, and this is the first time I've seen someone your age make a decision like that. Most adults twice your age wouldn't have the guts." Elara shook his hand. His grip was firm and steady, and she realized that it was the first handshake she had received from anyone since her mother's funeral, when people she didn't know had lined up to clasp her fingers and tell her that Catherine was in a better place. She had not believed them then. She was not sure she believed Decker now. But the gesture itself, the simple physical acknowledgement that she had done something worthy of respect, mattered more than she expected. The legal proceedings took 3 months. The courts moved with a speed that surprised everyone involved, driven partly by the sensational nature of the case. A hidden fortune, a century-old feud, a fire, an arrest, and partly by the volume of evidence that left very little room for ambiguity. Victor Ashford was charged with arson, breaking and entering, criminal trespass, assault, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The audio recording from Callum's phone proved devastating. Victor's own voice, captured with crystalline clarity, discussing his plan to break into Thornfield Manor, ordering Kovac to use force, instructing Diane to deploy the fabricated medical evaluation, and most damaging of all, admitting that he had been laundering money through Ashford Development for 15 years, using inflated construction contracts to wash cash from undisclosed offshore accounts. His attorney attempted to suppress the recording on grounds that it had been obtained without Victor's knowledge or consent. The judge denied the motion, ruling that Oregon's one-party consent law applied, and that Callum, as a participant in the conversation, had the legal right to record it. Victor took the stand in his own defense against the advice of his counsel. It was a catastrophic decision. Under cross-examination, he unraveled. The controlled, calculating businessman that Port Helion had known for decades disintegrated on the witness stand, replaced by a man consumed by a sense of entitlement so profound that he could not comprehend how anyone might see him as anything other than the rightful heir to everything the Hargrove family possessed. He called Cordelia a thief. He called Elara a squatter. He called the judge biased and the prosecution incompetent. By the time his attorney managed to get him off the stand, the damage was irreversible. He was convicted on all counts. The sentence was 18 years, Diane Ashford was charged as an accessory and with obstruction of justice for creating and presenting the fraudulent medical evaluation of Cordelia's mental capacity. The document she had shown Elara was not a genuine medical record. It had been fabricated by a physician named Dr. Harold Fenn, who owed Victor a substantial gambling debt and who, when confronted by investigators, cooperated fully in exchange for reduced charges. Dr. Fenn's testimony was detailed and damning. He described how Diane had provided him with a template, coached him on the specific language to use, and paid him $12,000 in cash for the forged evaluation. Diane's defense was more sophisticated than her husband's. She maintained that she had been acting under duress, that Victor had controlled and manipulated her throughout their marriage, and that she had participated in the scheme out of fear rather than greed. It was a plausible defense, and it might have worked if the prosecutors had not discovered her personal bank records. Diane Ashford had her own offshore accounts separate from Victor's, containing approximately $3.4 million in assets that could not be traced to any legitimate income source. She was not a victim. She was a partner. She was convicted of obstruction of justice and conspiracy to commit fraud. The sentence was 7 years. Kovac and the 2 unnamed associates were charged with breaking and entering assault and arson. Kovac, who had a prior record that included aggravated assault and illegal weapons possession, was denied bail and ultimately sentenced to 12 years. The 2 associates, both of whom cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for reduced sentences, received 4 years each. The trial made national news, not because of the criminal charges white-collar crime and real estate fraud were depressingly common, but because of the fortune. The hidden vault in the basement of a crumbling Victorian mansion on the Oregon coast captured the public imagination in a way that court filings and financial records never could. The gold alone was valued at approximately $4.7 million. The bearer bonds, once authenticated by a team of financial historians and archival experts, were worth an additional $3.2 million. The property deeds covering commercial parcels throughout downtown Port Helion represented land that Ashford Development had been using without proper title for decades, generating an estimated $6.8 million in back rent and unauthorized development profits. The total value of the Hargrove estate before adjustments was approximately $14.7 million. But the adjustments were significant. Elara's voluntary disclosure of Ezekiel Hargrove's confession triggered exactly the legal consequences Sergeant Decker had warned her about. A civil action was filed on behalf of the descendants of the families who had lost their savings in the 1929 bank fire. A separate wrongful death claim was filed by the great-grandchildren of Samuel Cross, the night watchman who had died in the blaze. The courts appointed a special master to evaluate the claims and determine appropriate restitution. The process was lengthy, contentious, and emotionally grueling. Elara sat through depositions and hearings where lawyers argued about the monetary value of suffering that had occurred nearly a century before she was born. She listened to descendants of the affected families describe how the bank fire had shaped their grandparents' lives, the poverty, the displacement, the generational trauma that rippled outward from a single act of desperation committed by a man who had been dead for 93 years. There was an elderly woman named Hazel Cross Pemberton, 81 years old, who took the stand and described growing up in a house where her grandfather's name was spoken in whispers. Samuel Cross had been the night watchman at the bank, a man who had taken the job to support his young family during the worst economic crisis in American history. He had fallen asleep at his desk on the night of November 12th, 1929, and he had never woken up. His wife had been left with 3 children and no income. The family had never recovered financially. The trauma had been passed down through the generations like an inheritance of a different kind. Not gold and bonds and property deeds, but silence and grief and an unanswerable question about why a good man had to die in someone else's fire. Elara listened to every word. She did not flinch. She did not look away. She sat in the courtroom gallery with her hands folded in her lap and absorbed the testimony the way the earth absorbs rain, not quickly, not easily, but completely. She understood in a way that the attorneys and the judge and the special master could not fully grasp what it meant to lose everything because of someone else's decision. She had lived that experience herself in a different form, in a different century. But the shape of the loss was the same. And when it was her turn to speak, she did not make excuses. "My great-grandfather committed a terrible act," she said, standing in the courtroom in the same hoodie she had worn the day she arrived at Thornfield Manor, because she had not yet bought new clothes, and because she refused to dress in a way that might make people forget where she had come from. "He set a fire that killed a man and destroyed the financial security of dozens of families. The fact that he did it to protect his own family from a different injustice does not excuse what he did. Nothing excuses what he did. I can't undo the past, but I can make sure that the wealth my family built on that foundation goes in part to the people who were harmed by it." She paused, and in the silence of the courtroom, she could hear the clock on the wall ticking, and she could feel the eyes of every person in the gallery on her face, and she thought about Cordelia, who had sat in rooms like this one and said nothing, who had carried the confession in a vault instead of carrying it in her voice. "My grandmother spent her life protecting a fortune and hiding a crime. My mother spent her life running from both. I am not going to protect it, and I am not going to run from it. I am going to do the thing that neither of them could bring themselves to do. I am going to let the truth stand on its own and accept whatever comes." She did not argue against any of the claims. She did not hire aggressive attorneys to minimize her exposure. She hired a single lawyer from Whitmore and Gaines, the same firm that had sent her the original envelope, and instructed him to cooperate fully with the restitution process. The final settlement reduced the Hargrove estate by approximately $7.4 million. The gold was partially liquidated to fund the payments. The bearer bonds were surrendered to a court-administered trust for distribution to verified descendants. The property deeds were retained, but a portion of the back rent owed by Ashford Development was redirected to a community fund for Port Helion.
When the accounting was finished, Elara Wynn's net inheritance was approximately $7.3 million. It was less than half of what she could have kept if she had hidden the confession. She did not regret a single dollar. Judge Lenora Stratton presided over the final probate hearing. She was 70 years old, white-haired, sharp-eyed, and possessed of a judicial temperament that combined rigorous legal reasoning with a deep, almost pastoral concern for the human dimensions of the cases that came before her. She had known Cordelia Hargrove. Not well, they had met at town functions and historical society meetings, but well enough to have formed an impression of the woman. After the final ruling was entered, Judge Stratton asked Elara to remain in the courtroom. The gallery had emptied. The court reporter was packing up her machine. The afternoon light came through the tall windows in dusty golden columns. "I want to say something to you off the record," the judge said, removing her glasses and setting them on the bench. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman. Stubborn, secretive, and occasionally infuriating, but remarkable. She spent her life protecting something she believed in, but she also spent her life hiding something she was ashamed of. She never found a way to reconcile those two things. She guarded the fortune, and she guarded the secret, and the weight of both of them crushed her." The judge leaned forward slightly. "I met Cordelia for the last time about a year before she died. She came to see me privately. She told me she was running out of time and that she had a granddaughter who didn't know she existed. She asked me off the record as a friend, not as a judge, whether she thought the truth would set the girl free or destroy her." The judge paused. "I told her I didn't know. I still don't know, but I know what you did with the truth once you had it, and I think that answers the question better than I ever could." She straightened in her chair. "What you did, disclosing the confession, accepting the consequences, that is something Cordelia could never bring herself to do. She loved the family too much to expose its sins. You loved the truth more than the money. That is not a common quality, Miss Wynn. Certainly not in this courtroom." Elara thanked the judge and left the courthouse. She walked through the parking lot to her car, still the Ford Fiesta, still dented, still burning oil, still carrying the faint smell of the fleece blanket and the Vienna sausages and the 4 months of survival that had preceded everything else. She drove back to Port Helion. The restoration of Thornfield Manor took 14 months. Elara hired Callum Bride to lead the project. This decision was not made easily or quickly. It was made after several long conversations in which neither of them pretended that what had happened had not happened. Callum had been paid by Victor Ashford to spy on Elara. He had accepted the money. He had carried the phone. He had photographed the map. The fact that he had ultimately turned against Victor and provided the evidence that brought him down did not erase the betrayal. It only complicated it. Elara did not forgive him because forgiveness was the right thing to do. She hired him because he was the best contractor she had access to, because he knew the house better than anyone alive, and because Cordelia had trusted him enough to let him build the escape tunnel. Cordelia's judgment had been imperfect. She had not known about Victor's bribe, but her instinct about Callum's craftsmanship had been sound.
I want to be clear about the terms.
Elara told him the day she offered him the contract.
They were standing in the driveway of the fire-damaged manor, the morning fog rolling in from the coast, the smell of char still hanging in the air. You work for me. You report to me. And if I ever find you photographing my documents again, you won't just lose the job. You'll lose every reference and every professional contact you've built in this county. Do you understand?
I understand, Callum said. He did not try to explain or justify. He did not bring up the recording or the fact that he had called the fire department or the fact that Kovac had split his forehead open. He simply accepted the terms and got to work. I want to be clear about the terms. Elara told him the day she offered him the contract. They were standing in the driveway of the fire-damaged manor, the morning fog rolling in from the coast, the smell of char still hanging in the air. You work for me. You report to me. And if I ever find you photographing my documents again, you won't just lose the job. You'll lose every reference and every professional contact you've built in this county. Do you understand?
I understand,
Callum said. He did not try to explain or justify. He did not bring up the recording or the fact that he had called the fire department or the fact that Kovac had split his forehead open. He simply accepted the terms and got to work. The work was extensive. The fire-damaged eastern wing was rebuilt from the framing outward using reclaimed timber sourced from other Victorian-era structures in the region. The roof was replaced, the foundation was resealed, the plumbing and electrical systems were brought up to code, and the interior was restored with painstaking attention to historical accuracy. The peeling wallpaper was replaced with hand-printed reproductions of the original patterns. The hardwood floors were sanded, repaired, and refinished. The grand staircase was rebuilt using white oak milled from a tree that had fallen on the property during a winter storm. Elara was involved in every decision. She chose the paint colors and the hardware and the light fixtures. She debated the merits of different roofing materials with suppliers. She learned to read architectural drawings and building code specifications. She spent hours in the county library researching the original construction techniques used in Victorian-era homes on the Oregon coast, so that the restoration would honor the house's history rather than merely replacing what had been lost. She was not doing this because she had a passion for architecture or historical preservation. She was doing it because Cordelia had asked her to protect the house, and because the house had protected her, had given her shelter. When she had none, had held a fortune in its walls, until she was ready to find it, and had refused to collapse even when someone set it on fire. The fireplace in the parlor was rebuilt around the original basalt stones, with the hidden cavity preserved behind a glass panel as a piece of the house's history. The family cemetery was cleaned, fenced, and landscaped, and the unnamed headstone Margaret's memorial. Cordelia's monument to the daughter she had lost was engraved with a simple inscription: Margaret Hargrove, 1965 to 2024. She chose a different path.
she was loved. Elara had spent a long time choosing those words. She had considered and rejected dozens of alternatives. Anything that mentioned the Ashfords or the fortune or the secret felt wrong, too public, too explanatory, too much like a footnote in someone else's story. Margaret had lived her life on her own terms, under her own name, in deliberate anonymity. She deserved an epitaph that honored that choice rather than undermining it. She chose a different path. She was loved. It was enough. It said everything that needed to be said. The vault in the basement was left intact, its steel door open, its shelves empty, a hollow monument to a century of secrets. A small brass plaque was mounted beside it, describing its history and its contents for anyone who cared to look. Elara had considered sealing it shut, bricking it over, erasing it from the house's layout. But that would have been another kind of hiding, and she was done with hiding. Elara did not take the money and relocate to a penthouse in Portland or a condo in Seattle. She stayed in Port Helion. She moved into Thornfield Manor as soon as the parlor and kitchen were habitable, sleeping on a cot beside the rebuilt fireplace while the construction continued around her. The house smelled of sawdust and fresh paint, and the faint, lingering trace of smoke that would take years to fully dissipate. She used a portion of the inheritance to establish the Margaret Hargrove Foundation, a nonprofit organization providing housing assistance, job training, and educational scholarships for homeless youth in Oregon. The foundation's first office was a converted storefront on Port Helion's main street, 2 blocks from the harbor, in a building that sat on land the Hargrove family had owned since 1893. The irony was not lost on her. The foundation's first program was a transitional housing initiative that provided furnished apartments, case management, and employment support for young adults aging out of the foster care system or experiencing homelessness. Elara had designed the program herself, drawing on 4 months of first-hand knowledge of what it actually means to have nowhere to go. The apartments had locks that worked. The kitchens had food in them. The bathrooms had mirrors, and on each mirror, Elara placed a post-it note with a handwritten message. "You are braver than you believe." Her mother's words, Catherine's words, Margaret's words, passed from one generation to the next in a different form through a different kind of inheritance. Elara also enrolled in community college courses at Clatsop Community College in Astoria, studying part-time while managing the foundation and overseeing the restoration. She was not sure what she wanted to study yet. She had started with basic courses, English composition, American history, introductory accounting, not because she found them particularly interesting, but because she had missed the second half of her senior year, when she became homeless and there were gaps in her education that needed filling before she could figure out what direction to take. The accounting course unexpectedly turned out to be the one that held her attention. Numbers were honest. They did not lie or hide or pretend to be something they were not. A balance sheet either balanced or it didn't. There was something deeply satisfying about that kind of clarity after a year in which every human relationship she had formed had been complicated by deception. She was not sure what kind of life she wanted to build, but she knew that whatever it was, it would be built on a foundation that could bear weight, not just the weight of money, but the weight of truth. The relationship between Alara and Callum did not resolve itself neatly or quickly. They worked together daily during the restoration, and their interactions were professional, competent, and marked by a careful distance that both of them maintained without discussing it. Callum did not ask for forgiveness. Alara did not offer it. What existed between them was not friendship, not romance, not animosity, but something more complicated, a shared history of crisis and compromise that did not translate easily into any conventional relationship category. There were moments, though, small ones. A Saturday afternoon when the plumber failed to show, and Callum and Alara spent 3 hours lying on their backs under the kitchen sink, passing tools back and forth in a rhythm that felt for the first time like partnership rather than transaction. A Tuesday evening when Alara found Callum in the basement sitting on an overturned bucket in front of the empty vault, just staring at it. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. He was quiet for a long time. "I'm thinking about what she built," he said, meaning Cordelia. "Not the vault. The plan. The 40-year plan. She was playing a chess game against an entire family, and she played it alone, and she won. And then she died before she could see the end game." "She didn't die before the end game," Alara said. "She just made sure someone else would be there to play it." Callum looked at her then, and something in his expression shifted, a softening, a recognition, and then a careful retreat back behind the wall he had built since the night she caught him with the phone. "You're better at this than she was," he said. "Better at what?" "Trusting people after they've let you down. She couldn't do that. That's why she ended up alone." "I haven't decided if I trust you yet," Alara said. "I know," Callum said. "That's what makes you better at it. You're deciding. She just decided once and never revisited it." On the day the restoration was completed, Callum knocked on the front door of Thornfield Manor. The door was new, heavy oak, hand-carved, hung on brass hinges that swung smoothly and silently. "The punch list is done," he said. "Every item. House is finished." Alara stepped onto the porch. The wraparound veranda had been rebuilt in its original configuration, and the view from the front steps was the same view Cordelia had painted into the background of her portrait. The rolling green forest, the distant glimmer of the Pacific through the trees, the long gravel driveway curving down through the Douglas firs. The Ford Fiesta was parked at the bottom of the driveway. Alara had not sold it. She had not traded it in. She had not even had it repaired beyond a new battery and an oil change. It sat there with its cracked windshield and its dented fender and its odometer that read 171,000 miles, a monument to the 4 months that had made her who she was. She did not keep the car because she was sentimental.
She kept it because she never wanted to forget what it felt like to have nothing. She never wanted to lose the knowledge that comfort is not a right, but a gift, and that the distance between a bed and a back seat is shorter than most people realize. Sometimes, when the restoration noise was too loud, or the foundation paperwork was too dense, or the weight of being 18 and responsible for a multi-million-dollar estate and a century of family history became too heavy to carry, standing up, she would walk down the driveway, open the Fiesta's rear door, and sit in the back seat. Just sit there in the cramped, musty space that smelled faintly of vinyl and fleece, and the ghost of Vienna sausages, and breathe. She did not cry. She did not sleep. She just sat and remembered and let the memory of what she had survived remind her of what she was capable of surviving next. It was not therapy. It was not a coping mechanism. It was a conversation with a version of herself who no longer existed, the homeless girl in the parking lot, the ghost in the system, the invisible person who had been erased by poverty and resurrected by a cream-colored envelope. That girl had something that Alara, with her inheritance and her foundation and her slowly rebuilding life, could never afford to lose. That girl knew what mattered. "Thank you, Callum," she said. He nodded. He looked at the house, then at her, then at the house again. Something in his expression shifted, softened, and then settled back into the careful neutrality he had maintained for 14 months. "Your grandmother would be proud of you," he said. "I hope so," Alara said. "But I didn't do it for her." She went inside and closed the door behind her. The parlor was warm. A fire crackled in the rebuilt hearth, casting amber light across the refinished hardwood floors and the new wallpaper and the furniture she had chosen, not antiques, not reproductions, but simple, solid pieces that she had picked out herself because they were comfortable and because they were hers. On the mantelpiece in the center sat the music box. Alara had repaired the hidden panel in the base, fitting it with new brass pins so that it closed seamlessly. The box looked the same, as it always had small, dark walnut green-tinged hinges, the letter M barely visible on the underside. But inside, next to the velvet-lined cylinder that played the ancient lullaby, she had placed a second photograph. The first photograph was the one that had always been there, Cordelia holding baby Alara 19 years ago. The second was the one she had found in the cemetery, Cordelia holding baby Margaret, 1965. 3 generations of Hargrove women captured in 2 images, separated by 40 years and connected by a music box, a lullaby, and a stubbornness that refused to die. Alara opened the lid. The cylinder turned. The melody played delicate, precise, ancient, and unbroken. She sat in the armchair by the fire in a house that had nearly killed her and that she had saved in a town where her family's name was now spoken with a complicated mixture of admiration and sorrow, holding a fortune that was smaller than it could have been and cleaner than it had ever been.
Outside, the Oregon rain began to fall, tapping gently against the new roof of Thornfield Manor, running down the fresh paint of the clapboard siding, pooling in the gravel driveway, where a rusted Ford Fiesta sat beneath the ancient Douglas firs, its windows dark, its back seat empty, waiting for no one.